Story 1.
I exposed my cheating wife's lies, took everything from her, and left her with nothing but regret. I reflected on the recent weeks, struggling to pinpoint any specific evidence that would suggest she was cheating. The sense of unease within me resulted from various small incidents accumulating, leaving me with an unsettling feeling. While I sensed something was amiss, I couldn't identify it precisely. Although I was fairly certain that something was happening, I lacked proof and details regarding who, what, or where it might be occurring. Doubts about my own sanity surfaced, questioning whether I was overreacting or imagining scenarios of her infidelity. Despite my uncertainty, my gut was in turmoil, indicating that something indeed was going on. It could be the early stages of a fling or affair, perhaps a one-time occurrence. Strangely, the more I dwelled on these thoughts, the more convinced I became. I'd been grappling with these concerns for what felt like weeks. But how long had the situation been unfolding before I became slightly aware that something was wrong? I took another sip of my JD, signaling the bartender, who nodded with a half-smile, having seen that troubled look many times before. Surveying the quiet bar filled with indistinct chatter, I noticed a lack of joy. The patrons had bland, unremarkable faces, all nondescript and average. The only woman in the place, in her 40s, possibly overdressed for the time and place, seemed a bit desperate, receiving drinks from an older guy. He appeared hopeful, though looking at her, he didn't need to try so hard, she already had his number. Other patrons were merely passing time while the rain outside fell, further dampening spirits. Soon, each would run out of reasons to stay in the sanctity of the bar and head homeward. I remained undecided about my course of action. I turned towards the voice, and there she was, looking at me with eyes that seemed to peer into my soul. As I attempted to respond, words eluded me. In the dimly lit bar, water dripping from her, Sammy started to remove her coat, and I questioned her presence. Curious, I asked why she was here. Sammy explained that she was worried about me, sensing that she would find me at the bar. She suggested we talk. I stared at her, wondering about her motives. Could I trust her? To steady myself, I took a sip of my JD and ordered her a vodka and soda. We waited for the bartender to move away before resuming our conversation, our eyes conveying uncertainty and a subtle struggle for dominance. Sammy pointed out that my recent behavior had caught her attention, sensing that I carried the weight of the world on my shoulders. I looked into her brown eyes but quickly averted my gaze. There was an unspoken understanding between us. I assured her that everything was okay between us, attempting to downplay the situation. However, she wasn't convinced. My heart sank as I realized my attempts to minimize the issue were futile. Placing her glass on the table, Sammy locked her fingers together, leaning slightly forward. She told me she knew what was going on. Confused, I feigned ignorance, but Sammy insisted. We moved to a booth for privacy, reluctantly agreeing. I asked her what she thought she knew, attempting to deflect the conversation. Sammy saw through my bluff, asserting that I couldn't lie to her after our long history. She encouraged me to talk, insisting that I needed someone to confide in. I'd known Sammy since she was 17. She was a constant presence and harbored a crush on me when I initially dated her sister Claire, who was 3 years older. Despite their differences, Sammy and I always got along, occasionally leading to sibling clashes with Claire. Over the years, Claire and I married after 2 years and settled into what I perceived as an ideal future. Both working in decent jobs, we earned enough for a comfortable life. Sammy, my sister-in-law, had enjoyed her late teens and early 22s and, at 25, sought a more mature phase in life. She had matured into someone any guy would be fortunate to be close to. Claire and I had been married for 5 years, with our anniversary due in another month. Contemplating whether we would make it that far, Sammy, an attractive woman and a friend besides my sister-in-law, looked at me with my eyes filling. Struggling to articulate my emotions while her resounding "I know" echoed in my mind. Sammy reached across the table, offering support. As her fingers gently stroked mine, I felt my heart slowly breaking. As she spoke, she mentioned that if I wouldn't say it, she believed she knew that Claire was cheating on me. Despite the shock of her words, I stubbornly tried to process what I knew and its implications. I resisted hearing more, convincing myself that if I didn't acknowledge it, it couldn't be happening, sparing me from the pain of confronting the truth. Sammy noticed my glassy-eyed expression and questioned whether it was shock or denial. She expressed her love for me and urged me to wake up, suggesting that it might be a misunderstanding. In response, I attempted to deflect her and continued deceiving myself. Sammy's eyes flashed with rage, and she exclaimed, drawing the bartender's attention. I assured the bartender that everything was fine. Sammy apologized, expressing her frustration with me and emphasizing her concern for my well-being. She urged me to wise up and face the reality of the situation, emphasizing that we needed to take action. I agreed to start, and Sammy shared her suspicions. She recounted an incident from a few weeks ago when she was with my partner and she received a call on her mobile. Sammy found it peculiar that Claire left the room to take the call, considering they were sisters. I nodded, feeling a sense of dread. Continuing her story, Sammy revealed that she checked Claire's phone, discovering there was no lock code. The call was from a guy, saved as Robert. Sammy didn't know any Robert or Bob but decided to monitor for any recurrence. I asked about the identity of this Robert or Bob guy, seeking clarification. After about a week, Sammy discovered the identity of the guy my partner had been messaging. He was someone she knew from years ago, before our relationship began. Apparently, they reconnected through social media or chat sites, and their messaging had been going on for a few weeks. I admitted that I had no knowledge of these interactions, only sensing that there were small things keeping us apart. Sammy acknowledged this but explained that it was all part of what they were doing, nothing overt, but it seemed like things were falling into place for them. Curious, I asked if it was just a couple of friends messaging each other, perhaps reminiscing about old times. Sammy confirmed that it started that way but hinted that something had changed. I was surprised and asked if I hadn't noticed anything suspicious. I mentioned that it felt like circumstances were conspiring to keep us apart, and there was an obvious lack of opportunity for any fun, too. Sammy stared at me incredulously, expressing a sense of disbelief. I returned her gaze, awaiting her next words. She urged me to pull my head out of the metaphorical sand, emphasizing her love for me. In response, I questioned the extent of the situation, seeking to understand how far it had gone. Sammy met my gaze, and her eyes briefly flickered, providing an unspoken confirmation. My anger began to simmer within me, prompting a quick barrage of questions about when, how, and where these encounters had taken place. Sammy shared that she knew my partner had met the other guy at least 3 times over the past 2 weeks. Initially unsure, Sammy only became certain 2 days ago that the situation had progressed. She had a lunch with one of her friends who worked with Claire, and some information slipped out during their conversation. Sammy discovered that Claire had met the guy twice for lunch and at least once for dinner the previous week. She asked if this aligned with what I had observed or suspected. I looked at her as I took in her words. There were a couple of times recently when I had called her office to arrange a lunchtime meet, and she wasn't there or had just gone out. Was that when she met him? Then last week she had that seminar thing she just had to attend. It was a late notice thing and arranged for after work. She had gotten home late that night, after 12. Thinking back, she had come in saying that it had dragged on, and the team had gone for a drink in the hotel bar to unwind before leaving. No love-making that night, I remember, and she hit the shower before bed too. My mind was racing, my brain scrambled as I took in these hurtful facts. Sammy expressed concern, telling me not to do anything reckless that could lead to legal trouble. I could sense the change in her expression as I made my decision. I declared my refusal to tolerate the situation any longer and vowed to put an end to it. I affirmed that I would not accept a cheating partner and was determined to make them both pay for their actions. Sammy cautioned me, advising against impulsive actions without a plan. Her words had a strange way of helping me calm down, confirming that my suspicions were indeed true. Seeking more information, I asked if she knew where my partner might be at that moment. Sammy confirmed that she believed my partner was currently with the other guy, explaining that it was the reason she sought me out. The rage resurfaced, prompting me to pound the table. People in the bar turned to look as I signaled the bartender. I asked Sammy if she knew the exact location. Sammy explained that she didn't know the exact location, but planned to speak with my partner the next day to gather more information. She mentioned that the other guy is married with a couple of kids, though she wasn't sure about his residence. She assured me that she would try to find out more to assist in the situation. I expressed gratitude, reaching for her hand and holding it tightly as I wiped away a tear from her cheek. I thanked her for her support, acknowledging the difficulty of the situation for her. Sammy, looking worried, asked about my plans. I assured her that I couldn't act on my impulses just yet, but intended to put an end to the situation definitively. I promised there would be consequences, without remorse, for both of them. In the meantime, I planned to secure what was rightfully mine and gather evidence for my next course of action. As I finished my JD, I signaled the bartender, slipping him a note and telling him to keep the change. Sammy continued to look concerned and asked when I planned to confront my partner. I considered the situation, planning to make some calls the next day while addressing my assets. I emphasized my determination not to give her a single penny. Sammy pointed out the difficulty of being around my partner, and I acknowledged that it had been challenging for the past few weeks. I believe that if she hadn't noticed any change by now, she likely wouldn't in the future. Sammy stood up, expressing her need to leave. I offered to talk again tomorrow, and she agreed, promising to find out more for me. She put on her coat, and I stood to help her, feeling her proximity. She resembled her sister so much as she looked up at me, tears in her eyes. I kissed her cheek, reassuring her that I would be fine. She smiled and left, disappearing into the dark and wet evening. Sitting back down, I took a deep breath, contemplating my next steps. One thing was clear in my mind: they would pay, and the retaliation would be swift, relentless, and unforgiving. Update: I don't recall much after that. Somehow, I woke up in my own bed with a mouth like the bottom of a parrot's cage. My head was still swimming as I raised it off the bed. Rolling over, I noticed I was alone and there was no sign of Claire. My senses slowly awakened as I heard noises from downstairs. Sliding my feet over the side of the bed, I tried to stand. Waking up the next morning, I couldn't help but wonder about the events of the previous night. As I staggered to the bathroom, attempting to shake off the grogginess, I proceeded to rouse myself. Entering the kitchen, I found her there, inquiring about the state I was in. In response to her question, I vaguely mentioned having a drink with an old friend and getting carried away. Sitting down, I poured some orange juice, drank it, and poured another. When she probed further, asking about the friend's identity, my mind started to work. I mentioned a guy named Bob, explaining that I knew him from way back and that he was in town for a couple of days on business. At the mention of Bob, I noticed a flicker of something on her face as she turned. I elaborated, recalling our college days and football years together. Claire seemed puzzled, unable to remember Bob. Nevertheless, she brushed it off, expressing indifference as long as I had fun. It was the first warning sign. Seated across from me at the table, I thought about my conversation with Sammy the previous night. I casually inquired about her activities the night before, feigning interest. I looked into her eyes as she lied about finishing work and going for a light meal and a drink with colleagues. She claimed to be home by 9:30, expressing concern for me due to a late meeting. I knew she wasn't home by then, as I was still at home until 10 p.m., deciding to head to the bar when enough was enough. That was the second warning sign. She continued, mentioning some tasks she needed to complete in the morning and hinting at being late in the evening. Bob, an old friend, was expected to be in touch, and they had plans to catch up. I suggested inviting Bob over, emphasizing the pleasure of reconnecting with old friends. She agreed and asked if I remembered him, using an endearing term. She stared at me with a neutral expression, attempting to conceal any reaction, but I sensed something beneath the surface. Despite her poker face, I could perceive a hint of emotion. I dismissed her inquiry about inviting Bob over, assuring her that I would manage on my own. I decided to get ready for the day, having more orange juice and a couple of painkillers before leaving the house, ensuring I didn't miss the opportunity to collect my car left at the bar. 30 minutes later, I departed, while Claire continued preparing for her day. As I dressed, I contemplated the situation, my determination growing. This couldn't continue for much longer. I clenched my fists, angered by the thought of Claire with Bob, vowing revenge. I harbored intense resentment towards him. The workday proved chaotic, with a constant stream of calls, dealing with issues on the line. My secretary handled some calls, but I couldn't avoid crucial meetings. The tension within me intensified as I navigated through the day, fueled by a growing desire for retribution. By mid-morning, the initial rush eased off, and I had some almost free time to deal with my personal issues. I closed my office door and started to check out my financials. Within 15 minutes, I had tightened the purse strings and moved some cash out of reach. I also arranged a meeting with a solicitor to discuss a possible divorce. I still had a few days before that, so my thinking was that it would give me time to get more information, not that it would matter that much anyway. But it could give me some leverage. Claire had her own bank account and credit card, so there was no need to do anything there. It was access to our joint account that was of concern, but I plugged that loophole quickly, so if it came to it, she couldn't get any more than what was left. My own account was secure and only had a smallish balance. The rest was shifted out and safe. We had no children, so essentially it would be a straightforward split should it come to that. I had decided in my own mind that we could only get over this if Claire were to confess her sins, so to speak, and seek forgiveness. Any kind of reticence there, and we were done. That thought made me feel sad. I sat at my desk in silence as I mulled over what had transpired and the actions I had taken so far. Today, I needed more information on the Bob character and evidence, or would the fact that I knew about it be enough to really duck the two of them over? The phone interrupted my thoughts, and it was Sammy on the line. I shared that I was occupied with various thoughts and plans but had initiated some actions. Sammy provided additional information about the guy, Bob Stones, revealing that he was married. She had his address and workplace, obtained discreetly through her friend who had seen Claire with him. According to Sammy, they seemed to be growing closer despite attempts to conceal it. Acknowledging the start of potential evidence, I requested Bob's details from Sammy. Within minutes, I located his social media page and obtained a photo. Something about his face seemed familiar, triggering a vague memory. Despite the unsettling feeling, I decided to call Claire around lunchtime, intending to stir the container. During the call, Claire explained she had a meeting with a client named Mr. Stones, which added another layer to the situation. Suppressing my emotions, I kept the conversation casual, though her mention of Mr. Stones felt like a taunt. Strike three, I thought, determined to take swift and merciless action against both of them. Ending the call, I masked my anger, promising to see her later and enduring her declaration of love with a clenched jaw. After ending the call, my anger boiled within me. Seated there, I clenched my teeth, contemplating the unsettling revelation. My secretary appeared, poking her head into the office, offering to grab something from the deli down the street. Considering for a moment, I instructed her to surprise me with something substantial, hearty, and rich in red meat, something to sink my teeth into. She gave me a peculiar look but nodded, closing the door behind her, sensing that my behavior had been unusual all morning. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. Sammy visited her sister's office and noticed Claire leaving the elevator alongside a tall, dark-haired man, roughly around 30 years old, Bob Stones. The man Sammy had identified from his online photo. Stepping in front of her sister, Sammy surprised Claire, who seemed uneasy about her plans being disrupted. Sammy explained her impromptu visit, expressing a desire to see her sister and possibly go for lunch. Claire, visibly uncomfortable, mentioned that she and Mr. Stones were having a business lunch and suggested meeting another time. Mr. Stones introduced himself, and Sammy, feigning innocence, asked how long he had known Claire. The question seemed to catch him off guard, and Claire hurriedly pulled him away, citing a meeting they needed to attend. As they left the building and entered a waiting cab, Sammy smiled, observing her sister looking back at her as they drove away. I sat in my office, munching through a massive sub filled with red meat, smiling to myself as I nodded at it slowly, savoring it while contemplating my next steps. Sammy had confirmed that Claire had left her office, so she called her secretary and found out she would be out all afternoon. Well, isn't that just ducking great? Everything was set regarding my finances, and I had a locksmith on speed dial with the terms pre-arranged. My solicitor was primed and ready to act as soon as I provided him with the remaining information he had requested. Okay, tonight was going to be the first stage. I was going to really mess with the pair of them for a little while before I pulled the trigger. My old man always told me, don't let them know you're coming for them, just take Route 1, be direct and destroy the bastards. A man of few, if not direct, words. Maybe that was something I had forgotten recently, but it was coming, it was on its way. Update: that evening at home, Claire walked in, appearing normal, and nothing seemed out of place until I detected a faint scent of men's cologne. As I went to kiss her, she noticed my reaction, and without verbalizing anything, I gave her a light kiss on the cheek and made my way to the door. Curious, she inquired about my plans, asking if everything was okay. I assured her that I was fine but had a matter to attend to. I explained that I was heading to Jerry's place for a poker game with a few colleagues from work, hoping it would be a good distraction. Closing the door behind me, I got into my car and left the driveway, grinding my teeth in frustration. Upon arriving at Jerry's, I parked outside and entered his garage. Jerry, a longtime friend with a history of dealing with the police, had combat training, making him the ideal companion for what I had in mind. He was a substantial figure, a friend since school, and I had called him earlier to seek his assistance. He readily offered his support without asking questions. This kind of unwavering support was exactly what I needed. We quickly slipped into the garage and I changed into a pair of dark overalls with a matching ski mask. We looked like two mime artists standing in silence. No words were exchanged as we got into a nondescript, second-hand car. Jerry had obtained nothing remarkable or noticeable about it. Cruising slowly across town to the address Sammy had given me, still no words passed between us. We had agreed on the format before, so there was no need for further discussion. Jerry parked the car outside Bob Stones's home, and there was no sign of life, with just one visible light. We waited in silence. As the front door opened, we saw him step out, get into his car, and ease down the road. Jerry followed at a safe distance. We already knew his destination, so there was no rush or panic. Parking at the driving range posed no problem, and we stayed in the car. The radio played in the background as we sat, watching and waiting. The tension inside me was almost unbearable, making it challenging to stay still. The urge to step out and walk around was strong, but we knew it was risky. Gradually, the car park emptied until only a couple of other cars remained. Both of us tensed as we observed him making his way to his car. Jerry got out and stealthily approached the target. Afterwards, I drove us out of the car park quietly, without drawing attention. Jerry remarked on the success of the operation as he removed his gloves and mask. I expressed gratitude, acknowledging that I appreciated his assistance. Jerry assured me not to worry, stating that he owed me and could never fully repay me for what I had done for him. I reminded him that friends help each other and pointed out that at least his hands weren't injured, and there was no CCTV in the car park. We considered the job well done. Deciding to head back, Jerry suggested starting a card game with the others, who would be there by now. We drove back, spending the next 4 hours playing poker for fun. The atmosphere among the guys was positive, and they understood the situation, providing the support I needed, boosting my confidence for the upcoming confrontation with Claire. However, before addressing the main issue, I planned to play some mind games with her. I stumbled through the door just after 1 a.m., intentionally exaggerating the amount I had to drink. Jerry had arranged for one of the guys to drop off my car. Claire, waiting up, questioned my lateness and examined me closely. I dismissed her concern, mentioning that Jerry and the guys had dropped me off in my car, admitting to having a bit too much JD. Disregarding my jacket and missing the coat pegs, I slumped onto the sofa and looked at her. Claire, with crossed arms and a disgusted expression, sat there. I maintained a blank expression, waiting for her to speak. She couldn't hold back and finally asked, "What is going on, Steve? Is there someone else or something? You're acting really weird lately." I chuckled, suppressing the anger building within me, reminding myself to take it easy. "I'm all right, my petal. Just been through a rough patch recently. It'll all be over soon." My words lingered in Claire's mind, leaving her unsure but sensing something amiss. We went to bed, and I pretended to collapse, feigning immediate sleep. It irked her, as she seemed ready for a confrontation, but I refused to engage. The following morning, Claire was the first to rise, making coffee. I descended the stairs, acting obnoxious, pretending to have a hangover. Playfully entering the kitchen, I greeted her and mentioned my throbbing head. She tossed a headache remedy my way. As I sipped my coffee, she appeared subdued, and I noticed her phone on the kitchen table. Wondering if she had received any calls, Claire noticed my gaze on her phone, and I could sense her desire to reach for it, although doing so would seem odd. Pouring more orange juice, I casually picked up the phone. A look of panic flashed across her face as I intercepted a message. I briefly glanced at it before sliding the phone back to her, stating that it needed charging to avoid a flat battery and any missed messages. Leaving the kitchen, I went to get dressed, leaving Claire looking after me with a sense that something was amiss. She wondered if I could know, dismissing the thought as she believed she had been careful. Their involvement had only been going on for a few weeks' lunches, dinner 3 times, and hotel stays 3 times. She considered it nothing more than fun, confident that I would never find out, especially since I wasn't going without. The revelation led her to contemplate her recent intimacy with her husband, unable to recall the last time. She pondered if her neglect might have contributed to my suspicions. Hastily descending the stairs, I swiftly exited the door, sidestepping Claire's attempt for a more passionate farewell. Waving and smiling, I pulled out of the driveway and headed to work. Around 11 a.m., I decided to send Claire a text for amusement, expressing regrets for the day and explaining that there was a lot on my mind, assuring her it would soon be resolved. I settled back, awaiting a reaction. Later in the day, Sammy visited me, inquiring about what had happened. I questioned Sammy about her earlier statement, asking her what she meant. Earlier in the day, an employee from the golf club had found Bob Stones in the trunk of his car, badly beaten. Claire had informed Sammy, and she was shaken. Sammy asked if I had done it, and I responded that I didn't care too much either way, denying any involvement. I went on to mention that Claire had told me she found out about Bob's condition through a scheduled meeting with him. His company had called, stating he was in the hospital and his wife had called them. Sammy found my explanation cute and plausible, but suggested that maybe next time it wouldn't be so easy for them. I was asked about my cryptic remark, and I replied, saying that accidents happen in the strangest places. That night, upon arriving home, Claire was absent, and her car was gone. There was no message. Irritated, I called her phone, cheerfully inquiring about her whereabouts. She responded, explaining that she was at the hospital visiting a friend, assuring me it wouldn't be long. I expressed my hope for her friend's swift recovery, bid her goodbye, and hung up before she could respond. 30 minutes later, she returned, looking drained. I asked about her friend's condition, expressing my hope that it wasn't too serious. Claire hesitated before responding, mentioning that it was nothing too dramatic. Her friend had just fallen and would be home in a few days. I suggested coffee, and she accepted, thanking me. While sipping her coffee, Claire brought up an incident at her workplace, mentioning that one of her company's reps had been assaulted the other night. I reacted with surprise, asking for details. She explained that he was attacked and left in his car overnight, but reassured me that he was okay. Bob wasn't hurt too badly, and it seemed like they wanted to mess him up for no reason. Nothing was stolen or anything. I couldn't help but think about the contradiction, given my prior denial of knowing Bob. Update: she noticed me looking at her and realized she had made a mistake. She tried to cover it up, but she knew it was too late. Now he was aware of the situation as well. Quickly, she hurried to make an exit to change. I suspected she would be on the phone any second, but to whom? I decided I needed to reassess my plan. Since things were escalating, I had to move things forward a bit. Calling upstairs to Claire, I informed her I needed to go out for a little while, reassuring her I wouldn't be long. I drove to Bob Stone's home address and knocked on the door. A petite, dark-haired woman opened the door. I explained that I was Steve Ryland, and my wife, Claire Ryland, had dealings with her husband. She looked at me nervously, yet intrigued. I requested to come in for a moment. In the lounge, she realized the gravity of the situation as I mentioned the affair between Claire and her husband. I expressed my regret for having to break the news and informed her that he was currently in the hospital. She folded inwardly, tears flowing for a few seconds, expressing her suspicions. She mentioned that she knew he was at it again and decided to divorce him. She felt that Claire had enough chances to come clean and the lies were unbearable. Unsure of how long the affair had been going on, she was convinced of Claire's betrayal. When I inquired about the incident the other night, she admitted uncertainty. I clarified that I didn't lay a finger on him and expressed my shock at the situation, indicating my lack of concern about whoever damaged him. I mentioned that I couldn't be sorry about it. I questioned if he might have been involved with another man's wife, to which she responded, "Nothing surprises me." She decided to keep him out of her life, emphasizing that they had moved back to the area because he was fooling around before. Before leaving, I provided her with my locksmith's and solicitor's contact information. Realizing the complexity of the situation as I drove slowly home, I focused on dealing with the other half of my problem. My inner rage was under control, understanding that once retribution began, it would run its course of action I would follow and relish for the most part. The end of my marriage saddened me, but I knew there was no going back from her betrayal. My one consolation was that the parties that caused me pain would experience it in far greater measure. I do not forgive. Update: I guided my car onto the driveway, noticing Claire's car exactly where she had left it just a couple of hours ago. Absent-mindedly tapping the bonnet as I passed, I approached my front door and slid my key into the lock. A heavy feeling settled in my heart, realizing this might be the last time I do this as a married man. Stepping inside, the weight of the recent worries pressed on my shoulders, making them incredibly heavy as I slowly moved towards the lounge. The murmur of the television greeted me as I neared the doorway. There, perched on the sofa, was Claire, her demeanor radiating fear and trepidation. A sense that something was amiss hung in the air, as if the game was up without a word being spoken. Nervously, she shook, trying to maintain composure. I stood silently watching her, and as our eyes met, I saw fear and attempt to speak, but nothing escaped her lips. Walking into the room, I passed her to fix myself a drink, remaining silent. I reached for my drink, my unblinking eyes locked onto hers. She waited, sensing something was amiss. My expression remained impassive as I observed the woman I had deeply loved, now balancing those feelings with the pain she had needlessly caused me. It was time for her to feel my pain. As I stared, she detected no reason for optimism in my face. Pulling herself together, Claire straightened up, deciding to brazen it out. Unaware of what I knew, she couldn't endure the incriminating silence any longer. She asked where I had been, and frustration crept into her voice at my silent treatment. I responded, saying that I would tell her where I went if she told me where she had been. Uncertainty flickered in her eyes as she insisted she was at the hospital visiting a friend. I maintained a blank expression and fear flashed across her eyes. She was rattled. Once again, she deflected the question back to me, thinking she had skillfully batted it away. I told her to stop the nonsense and explained that I visited a friend myself, someone I hadn't known for long. Our conversation was crucial, and although I hadn't met her before, we were now friends of sorts. I had an enlightening talk with her about her husband, Bob Stones, asking if she had heard of him. Her face flushed as I toyed with her emotions. I explained that I needed to talk to the Stones woman about her husband's infidelity, having discovered his affair. In response to my revelation, she offered concern, asking if I was okay and offering to get me a drink. I inquired about her knowledge of Bob Stone's affairs, watching her struggle to find words. I took the lead, telling her that I knew about her involvement with Bob and had known for a while. I challenged her to speak up before leaving, emphasizing that it didn't mean anything and was just closeness. I scoffed at her excuses, reminding her of the vows we both took. As she continued to defend herself, I called her out, expressing my frustration with her lies. I pointed out that she treated me like a fool, and her attempts to downplay the affair infuriated me. I sarcastically commented on the claim that it only happened twice, and questioned whether it was worth our marriage. She apologized, claiming it didn't mean anything, and expressing a willingness to make it up to me. I laughed bitterly, accusing her of being sorry for getting caught and questioning whether she would have stopped if not exposed. I asserted that all the lies she told had become second nature, and only she believed them. I told her that she was not the woman I fell in love with and married. She looked at me as the weight of my hurt started to penetrate her cheater's facade. She realized the seriousness of the situation and asked what she could do, promising to do anything. I informed her that we were done and called Sammy, letting her know about the situation. Sammy would be arriving shortly to pick her up. Claire, shocked, asked where she would go, and I responded harshly, saying she could go wherever she liked, even back to the hospital to see her boyfriend. He didn't care. We were done. Claire sat stunned as there was a knock on the door. I greeted Sammy and told her to get Claire out of here. I explained that if she didn't leave, I was afraid of what I might do to her. Despite hating what she had done, I still cared about her, but it was time for her to go. Sammy hurriedly gathered Claire's things for the next few days. I thanked Sammy for her assistance and mentioned that I would be in contact soon. As Sammy prepared Claire to leave, I listened to the sound of my wife sobbing. Sammy swiftly packed Claire's belongings into a couple of suitcases, and in less than 10 minutes she was removed from my home. The real challenge would be to get her out of my life permanently and erase the pain. Retribution would help with that. Staring into the flames of the pyre I had built in the backyard, I watched everything of Claire's go up in flames. There was no way I would allow her back into my house for anything.
Story 2.
My daughter urgently requested my presence, expressing concern about her mother's involvement with someone else. Despite the distance, I could discern her distress through the grainy video quality. I learned that my wife spent several nights a week with a man named Donald Connolly, the mayor, known for his big fancy car and occasional limo rides. Stacy, my daughter, shared details about his appearance and confirmed her fear about the situation, prompting me to assure her that I would try to come home. Stacy pleaded for my swift return, emphasizing the need for discretion in dealing with her mother. I promised to do my best, expressing love for her before ending the conversation. My name is Robert Crawford. I'm 42 years old and a design specialist for a large electronics firm. I'm also a major in the National Guard, and that's why I'm currently on a year-long assignment in Afghanistan, where I serve on the command staff. I've been married to the love of my life, Kathy, for 18 years, and the fruit of our union is our awesome 15-year-old daughter, Stacy. Kathy is 40 but looks even younger. She's the most beautiful woman I've ever known. 5 ft 6 inches, terrific body that actually improved after she gave birth to our daughter. Her dark brown hair down to her shoulders, and warm brown eyes that always sparkle when she smiles. And she smiles all the time. I could honestly say our marriage has been rock solid. Even when I've been deployed, our time together has been warm and loving, our lovemaking hot and always satisfying. I've never had a doubt about her fidelity, nor she mine. So what happened? I didn't have a clue. I completed all the necessary paperwork for 30 days of emergency family leave and caught a flight that 26 hours later found me renting a car at my hometown airport and heading for home. On Friday night around 6:30, I parked the car half a block from my house. The mid-November sun had set, and the streetlights cast an ominous glow on the neighborhood. Lights were on in the living room, kitchen, and upstairs master suite. I observed my wife moving around the house, appearing to get ready to go out. I discreetly called my daughter's cell phone, and she answered after 3 rings, speaking softly. I reassured her and asked if her mother was going out. She confirmed that her mother had been in her room for over an hour, heard the shower, and sensed her excitement for the night. Stacy expressed her dismay, wondering why her mother was putting the family through this. I advised against passing judgment until we knew the full story. Stacy asked about my plans, and I mentioned that I intended to follow them and assess the situation before deciding how to respond. She urged caution and asked if I needed to change clothes. I declined, mentioning that my camo fatigues would suffice for the occasion. We exchanged expressions of love, and I assured Stacy that we would always be together, regardless of the circumstances. At 7, a black Mercedes rolled into my driveway, and a tall, slender, well-dressed man emerged from the car. I anticipated him heading to the door, but instead, he conversed on his cell phone, and the lights in the master suite went dark. A minute later, the door opened, and my wife stepped onto the porch. She ensured the door locked behind her and briskly walked toward her date, wearing a big smile. Despite looking stunningly beautiful, my heart shattered when I saw her glance back at the house to make sure Stacy wasn't watching. Then, she shared a warm kiss with the mayor before he helped her into the car, and they drove away. Fortunately, I remained composed enough to capture the kiss with my cell phone. I followed them at a safe distance, encountering no issues due to the light traffic. They crossed town and arrived at the Radisson Hotel's parking lot. Parking a few spaces away, I observed as they exited the car and entered the building. Walking closely with arms around each other, I snapped another photo, revealing the evident long-term nature of their affair. They appeared so comfortable together, resembling a loving married couple on a date night. I waited until they entered the hotel before donning my camo hat and sunglasses, trailing behind them. Once inside, I couldn't see them, but it didn't concern me. I received the usual smiles and "thank you for your service" comments, which I acknowledged while checking the information board listing current events. One event stood out: the St. James Hospital Charity Ball on the 3rd floor, with live orchestra music filtering down to the lobby. Disregarding the elevators transporting couples to the ballroom, I opted for the stairs, avoiding swift detection and acknowledging the need for exercise after long flights. On the 3rd floor, I followed the music and easily found the ballroom. Passing the entrance, I glimpsed them inside, acting like the happy couple they portrayed, greeting friends and supporters. My wife briefly looked back at me, but there was no recognition. As far as she knew, I was still 10,000 miles away, facing flies, sandstorms, and the Taliban. I also noticed she wasn't wearing her wedding rings. After passing the entrance, I entered the men's room, sat in a stall, and contemplated my next moves. It was challenging to grasp what I had seen. I had been certain my marriage with Kathy was as solid as any could be. I felt foolish. While honoring my duty in Afghanistan, my loving wife was at home, dishonoring me, breaking our wedding vows. What was wrong with the people they were meeting? Didn't they realize the woman hanging on the mayor was married to an army officer serving overseas? Warm tears ran down my cheek, but I wiped them away. No time for self-pity. I had a plan to formulate and execute. At that moment, a much different enemy needed to be faced than the Taliban. Remaining in the bathroom stall for half an hour, I allowed the festivities to reach full swing before approaching the ballroom door. Only a few people at the entrance noticed me as I edged close to the wall and walked slowly to an area away from the bar and food tables. Behind a pillar, I had a clear view of most of the room. Although I lacked a ticket for the event, my uniform held more clout than any piece of paper. The young man taking tickets saluted me and said, "Welcome, sir," as I entered. The thought crossed my mind. It's unfortunate my wife and her lover don't show that kind of respect for me in the uniform I wear. It took me a few minutes to locate Kathy and her date. They were dancing to a slow song, my wife's arms around his neck, her head against his chest, his hands resting possessively on her bottom. I managed to take several photos, but it took all my willpower to keep from rushing onto the floor and decking the guy and kicking his balls up into his kidneys. However, that would only give me a little satisfaction and likely put me in jail. What I wanted, what I needed, was absolute proof of their affair, and then I would find an appropriate way to exact revenge for their total disrespect of me, our daughter, and the U.S. Army. They danced another dance. Then, arm in arm, they made their way to their table, sharing in faithful kiss and caress before they sat down. I captured it all in photos. Having seen enough for the moment, I made my way out to the hallway and found a seat where I could watch the ballroom doors and the elevators. As an Army officer, I had learned patience, and it paid off, since another 2 hours went by before the event began to wind down, and people made their way out the door and down the elevators. It wasn't long before my wife and the mayor made their exit, and stood just outside the door, talking. After a minute, they smiled at each other and turned together to the bank of elevators on their left, but instead of pushing the down button, they chose the one that would take them up. It was more than weird. I was only about 15 feet from them, sitting on a bench against the wall, wearing my camo fatigues and sunglasses, my name tag clearly displayed on the front of my uniform, looking totally out of place amid the tuxedos and ball gowns. And though many other couples noticed me and smiled or waved, my wife and her lover were so tuned into each other that they never gave me a glance. Observing them entering the elevator holding hands, I noted that their car stopped on the 11th floor. After confirming it didn't go up again and returned to the 3rd floor, where more couples were waiting, I headed back to the registration desk. I explained to the attendant that I had an urgent message for Mayor Connolly and showed my government ID, requesting his room number. Despite initial hesitation, she eventually disclosed that he was in room 1114. Thanking her, I took the elevator to the 11th floor and located room 1114. After checking the hallway for other occupants, I pressed my ear against the door, hearing only soft conversation. Unsatisfied, I proceeded down the hall, found the door to the stairs, and secured it with my handkerchief to prevent it from locking. Glancing at my watch, I noted it was midnight, as Stacy had mentioned. Her mother usually came home between 2 and 3, and once lately at 7, so I had a long wait. But again, my army training and patience paid off. Through the window in the door, I could see room 1114, so I wouldn't miss them when they were done with their lovemaking fest. As I waited, I tried to keep my mind on the task at hand, but the truth is, I kept imagining her a-hole lover, plunging his tool deep into my wife who had pledged to be mine alone. I could say my heart was broken, but it went far beyond that. I could feel my life spiraling down into a dark abyss where only pain and rejection and humiliation left. I knew I had to keep myself composed for my daughter's sake, but the realization that the woman I loved more than anything else on earth, whom I trusted with every fiber of my being, was at that very moment giving her body and soul, her love and passion to another man, overwhelmed me with a tidal wave of pain. Around 1:30, I stepped out of the stairwell and pressed my ear against their door, hearing faint sounds that resembled moaning. Then I distinctly heard my wife exclaiming, "Yes, oh God, yes, do me, Dawn, do me hard like that, you're so good," she screamed, a sound I had heard many times before during faithful moments with me. With tears streaming down my cheeks, I returned to the stairwell. Anticipating they would conclude soon and leave their love nest within the next hour, I exited the stairwell for the final time at 2, positioning myself against the wall outside their room, ready to capture their exit on my cell phone's video. 15 minutes later, I heard the chain being removed and the door click open, and I began recording as they emerged. He had his arm protectively around her, and she leaned against him, smiling. Kathy looked freshly scrubbed and well-groomed, while Donald Connolly appeared pleased with himself. They kissed briefly, turned towards the elevators, and Kathy noticed me leaning against the wall. I confronted Kathy about her actions, questioning how her rendezvous with her lover went. Upon realizing my presence, Kathy appeared shocked, placing her hand on her heart and expressing disbelief. She fell to her knees, pleading that this wasn't supposed to happen and that I wasn't meant to see it. Her lover, taking a moment to register the situation, insisted that it wasn't what it seemed and that Kathy was merely assisting with his new campaign. I sarcastically remarked on the irony of such campaign tactics involving infidelity. I questioned the mayor's morality, highlighting the impact on my marriage while I was away serving the country. The mayor attempted to deny any closeness involvement, urging Kathy to corroborate his story. Disregarding his plea, Kathy rejected his attempt to manipulate the situation, recounting the witnessed kissing, moaning, and phrases heard through the door. I conceded defeat, acknowledging that my wife was now his. Expressing frustration and calling them both cowards, I emphasized that even my daughter was aware of their actions. The mayor stood there, stunned and unsure how to respond, while my wife knelt on the floor, sobbing. I informed Kathy not to bother coming home that night and suggested she spend it with her lover instead. I mentioned my intention to comfort our daughter and stated that on Monday I would file for divorce, followed by informing the news media. Expressing my frustration about the mayor's actions in running the city, I instructed Kathy to stay away until I returned from my 30-day emergency leave, after which she could decide how to proceed with her life. Kathy pleaded with me, asking for forgiveness for her infidelity during my deployment and requesting not to disclose it to our daughter, who already knew about the situation. I expressed my confusion over her actions, but acknowledged that they had chosen each other. Disheartened, I left for the elevator as Kathy apologized, but I couldn't find it in me to accept her remorse. Observing their apparent happiness together, I left them with a harsh farewell and stepped into the elevator, leaving them behind. When I arrived home, I found Stacy waiting for me, clearly upset. She embraced me tightly, expressing how much she had missed me. I reassured her of my own feelings and confirmed that I had found her mother and the mayor together. Stacy affirmed that she wasn't concerned about her mother's absence, stating that she had felt neglected in her absence. She pleaded to come with me when I returned to Afghanistan, but I explained that she needed to stay here. Stacy insisted that she couldn't stay with her mother, expressing her resentment towards her. Despite her feelings, I reminded her that her mother was still her mother. Stacy tearfully expressed her belief that her mother didn't love her and sought comfort in my arms. I held her as she cried. I finally convinced Stacy to go to bed, and I secured the house, including setting the door chains just in case Kathy decided to try to come home. I had no proof that Kathy and her lover had used any of our bedrooms for their trysts, but I didn't want to take a chance, so I slept on the couch, even though I wasn't sure they hadn't had lovemaking there either. Sleep came only in spurts, 45 minutes here, half an hour there. I kept thinking about how I would handle the situation when Kathy came to claim her clothes and personal items she'd need until I left in 30 days. I could have been a nice guy and taken a hotel room, leaving the house to her, but I just couldn't find it in my heart to be that nice. She was the one that destroyed our marriage so she could at least suffer the minor inconvenience of being displaced from her home for a month. Besides, I'm certain her lover would be happy to put her up. They'd been acting like a married couple now. They could live like one for a while, call it a trial marriage. Stacy and I both slept until noon, or at least until around noon. I woke up first and prepared coffee, then made toast and scrambled eggs for us. We engaged in small talk while eating, and then proceeded to rinse the dishes and load them into the dishwasher. Suddenly, the phone rang, and Stacy and I exchanged glances before she answered it. Stacy spoke with her mother, expressing skepticism about her sincerity. She mentioned the ongoing affair with Donald Connolly and emphasized that it wasn't a one-time mistake. Stacy admitted to being the one who urged me to return home, highlighting her mother's neglect and obsession with her affair. Despite her mother's plea not to hurt Mayor Connolly, Stacy refused to comply, indicating her frustration and disappointment. After the call, Stacy remarked on her mother's apparent confusion and lack of understanding regarding the situation. She expressed her concern that her mother didn't grasp the gravity of her actions and couldn't comprehend why I didn't want her to return home. I reassured Stacy that her mother's lack of understanding would become apparent as consequences unfolded. The rest of the day passed quietly, with attempts to distract ourselves from thoughts about Kathy and Mayor Connolly. We discussed Stacy's future plans, with me suggesting she stay in her current environment, despite her concerns about her friends' reactions to her mother's actions. I told her that real friends would stand beside her, but she wasn't convinced. We settled things with my assurance that I'd call my mom to see if Stacy could stay with her until my deployment ended, hopefully in another 5 or 6 months. Late in the afternoon, the phone rang again. It was Kathy. I answered, but as soon as I heard Kathy say, "Bob, oh Bob, please give me a chance to explain," I passed the phone to Stacy without saying a word. "What, Mom?" Stacy's voice was hard and cold, and she held the phone away from her ear so I could hear what her mother was saying. Kathy insisted on speaking with Stacy's father, despite Stacy's resistance. Stacy demanded an explanation for Kathy's actions over the past 6 months, accusing her of betraying their family. Kathy defended herself, claiming she didn't intend to hurt anyone, while Stacy continued to express her disappointment and anger. Throughout their conversation, Kathy could be heard crying. Stacy expressed her hurt and disappointment towards her mother, emphasizing the pain caused to their family due to Kathy's actions. Kathy responded by expressing her love for Stacy and her husband, prompting skepticism from Stacy. Kathy then quietly requested some personal items, including clothes and birth control pills, expressing regret and frustration. Throughout the conversation, Kathy could be heard crying. Stacy sarcastically remarked about Kathy potentially becoming pregnant with the mayor's child and the inconvenience it would pose. She then mentioned packing Kathy's belongings, including clothes and birth control pills, and hinted at Kathy's need for makeup to maintain her appearance as the town's social figure. Stacy concluded by stating that Kathy's belongings would be left at the curb for her to retrieve. After ending the call, Stacy started crying, and I comforted her by wrapping my arms around her. I acknowledged that she had been tough on her mom, but I understood her anger. I assured her that we would overcome this situation together. After giving her another hug, I left her to gather the items her mother needed. I retreated to my office to strategize, drawing on my military training to meticulously plan our next steps. I viewed the situation as a battle that required careful planning and execution. The tasks I needed to handle were mostly straightforward. I planned to hire a divorce lawyer, cancel our joint credit cards, obtain separate credit cards for myself and Stacy, change the beneficiary on my life insurance and retirement plans to Stacy, and transfer half of the funds from our checking and savings accounts to new accounts accessible only by Stacy and me. However, figuring out how to deal with Mayor Connolly posed a greater challenge. I believed he deserved punishment for his actions, and I wanted to ensure he was exposed as the cowardly, wife-stealing individual he truly was. Later that evening, around 8 o'clock, I received a phone call at home. Answering, I identified myself as Robert Crawford. The caller introduced himself as Ray Swanson, a city councilman and a friend of Mayor Connolly. He expressed a desire to discuss what he referred to as a little misunderstanding involving me, my wife, and the mayor the previous night. I found his choice of words concerning, especially considering the gravity of the situation involving my wife and Mayor Connolly's affair. Ray expressed his belief that there was no need for harsh language, suggesting that the situation involved a simple late-night gathering between consenting adults who had perhaps overindulged in drinks. He seemed optimistic that discussing the matter could resolve everything. However, I rebutted, stating that Mayor Connolly had been involved in an affair with my wife for the past 6 months while I was deployed in Afghanistan, and I had caught them together the previous night. Ray acknowledged the difficulty of the situation for me, but hoped we could find a resolution for everyone's benefit. I retorted, questioning who exactly he meant by everyone, emphasizing that my primary concern was for my daughter, and the concerns of others were of little importance to me. Ray expressed his concern, mentioning the mayor's influence in the community and the potential consequences for anyone who caused damage to his reputation. In response, I asked if he was making a threat, to which Ray clarified that he was merely stating the reality of the situation and expressed his reluctance to see damage come to me or my loved ones. I then issued a warning to Ray, urging him to listen attentively. I emphasized my experiences dealing with the Taliban over the past 6 months, indicating that I would not shy away from confronting someone like Mayor Connolly, whom I described as a dishonorable individual involved in stealing another man's wife. I asserted that neither Ray nor the mayor had faced an opponent of my caliber before. I conveyed to Councilman Swanson that I was unfazed by his perceived power and warned him of the consequences of challenging me. I mentioned that my soon-to-be ex-wife neglected to inform the mayor of the repercussions of involving herself with me. Furthermore, I highlighted the extensive support network I had among former military personnel within a 100-mile radius, emphasizing our disdain for individuals who exploit soldiers' spouses during overseas deployments. I advised Councilman Swanson to distance himself from Mayor Connolly to avoid facing the repercussions of his actions, hinting at the impending consequences for the mayor. Ray attempted to negotiate with me, suggesting that a substantial sum of money could resolve the situation. However, I dismissed his proposal, expressing my intense anger towards Donald Connolly for exploiting a soldier's wife while I was deployed. I asserted that no amount of money could alleviate the pain caused to my daughter and me. I insisted that the only resolution satisfactory to me would involve Connolly and my wife experiencing the same pain they inflicted on us. I authorized Ray to convey this message to both of them, Ray expressed his concern, acknowledging the potential fallout from the situation. He sought a resolution to mitigate the consequences. I responded by outlining the steps necessary for resolution, including Connolly publicly admitting to the affair and resigning as mayor. I emphasized that nothing less would prevent me from exposing him and seeking retribution. Ray expressed surprise at the seriousness of my intentions. I assured him of my resolve. Excusing myself, I mentioned needing to prepare dinner for my daughter. Stacy arrived from the garage, informing me that she had placed her mother's belongings by the curb, where they were picked up by an unfamiliar individual driving a black Mercedes. Ray joked about the possibility of the clothes ending up for sale at Goodwill if not collected by the right person. I mentioned that I had packed Stacy's regular clothes, but hesitated to include her fancy nightgowns. I expressed my discomfort at the sight of some particularly provocative teddies she owned. Stacy acknowledged my concern with a nod. I advised her that she would eventually need to address the situation with Stacy, to which she responded that she would do so when the timing felt right. The weekend passed without further incident. Stacy assisted me with laundry, while I focused on my plan to expose Mayor Connolly. On Monday morning, I contacted a contact at the local paper, John Foster, and arranged to meet him for coffee at Danny's. John, a former sergeant in my National Guard company, greeted me warmly. During our conversation, I provided John with some information regarding Mayor Connolly's affair with the wife of one of our soldiers during our deployment in Afghanistan. I refrained from disclosing the soldier's identity, emphasizing the sensitivity of the matter. I stressed that if I were in the soldier's position, I wouldn't want such betrayal to become public knowledge. I shared observations of Connolly's faithful interactions with the soldier's wife, leaving the decision of how to proceed with John. I informed John that contrary to rumors, the woman involved in the affair was not separated or going through a divorce. Her husband only recently became aware of the situation. I acknowledged John's concern about making baseless accusations against the mayor and the risk of legal action. When asked about evidence of the affair, I presented the pictures and videos I had captured, though I requested that the woman's identity be partially obscured. John understood the implications and appeared uneasy. I expressed my resolve to John, acknowledging that although the truth would eventually surface, I was prepared to confront the shame. I explained that during Connolly's affair with my wife, I was overseas, unaware of the situation. I emphasized to John the betrayal inherent in taking advantage of a soldier's absence by engaging in infidelity with his spouse. John, understanding the gravity of the situation, offered to look into the matter further. After confirming that the affair had persisted throughout my deployment, I transferred the evidence to his cell phone. We briefly reminisced about fallen comrades from our company before parting ways with a handshake. I proceeded with the next step, which involved searching online for a reputable divorce lawyer. After reviewing references, I selected R.J. Collins, ESQ, and scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. Upon arriving at the office, I was surprised to find that R.J. stood for Revenge Joy, a woman in her 50s with a straightforward demeanor. She wasted no time in asking how she could assist me. I informed her of my need for a divorce, preemptively warning her that it would not be amicable due to my wife's affair with the town mayor during my deployment. She reacted with surprise, dropping the pin she had been holding. I confirmed to Joy that the mayor in question was indeed Connolly, and proceeded to provide her with a detailed account of the situation, which she attentively listened to for the next half hour. She took notes throughout, occasionally pausing to seek clarification or ask questions. When I mentioned my daughter Stacy, Joy inquired about her feelings regarding the matter, to which I explained that she was deeply upset and reluctant to stay with her mother during my deployment. Considering Stacy's age and preferences, Joy suggested the possibility of having her stay with my mother instead. I agreed, and decided to contact my mother to arrange it. Our discussion continued for nearly an hour. I provided Joy with an overview of our financial situation, and she advised me to discuss potential resolutions with my wife. I explained to Joy that witnessing the closeness between my wife and the mayor left no possibility for reconciliation, and I requested that she prepare the divorce papers promptly. Over the following week, Kathy contacted me 5 times, but I kept the conversations brief, promising to update her on the proceedings later. On Friday, Joy informed me that the divorce papers were prepared and required information about where they should be served. I informed Joy that I intended to invite Kathy to my home the following Monday at 2 o'clock, while Stacy was at school, so she could be served with the divorce papers. I called Kathy's cell phone and arranged the meeting for Monday at 2 at the house. Kathy attempted to engage in conversation, seemingly prepared to explain her actions, but I cut her off, stating that she would have the opportunity to speak later. On Monday, Kathy arrived a few minutes early, and we sat down at the kitchen table. Seeing her, I felt a pang of emotion. Despite the circumstances, she looked beautiful. I offered her coffee, but she declined, requesting only water. I acknowledged her desire to speak and assured her that she would have the chance to do so. However, I also informed her that someone would arrive shortly to serve her with the divorce papers. Her expression turned pale. I explained to Kathy that I didn't desire the situation either, just as I hadn't desired her affair with Donald Connolly. I indicated that it seemed neither of us would have things go our way. Kathy pleaded with me to listen to her explanation, expressing hope for a resolution. I agreed to hear her out. She recounted how she had worked on Donald's election campaign and developed a friendship with him during my deployment. Feeling lonely and depressed, she found solace in Donald's companionship. Kathy recalled attending a dinner event with Donald, where he advised her to use her maiden name and leave her wedding rings at home to avoid gossip. She admitted that she hadn't thought much of it at the time, but recognized now that removing her rings was a mistake. That night, Kathy recounted, she mingled with numerous people, all of whom perceived her as a single woman. When I inquired about when the affair began, Kathy admitted that it didn't start immediately, but rather after a night of close dancing and a goodnight kiss when Donald dropped her off. She justified her actions by expressing her loneliness and the allure of being treated like royalty by someone prominent in the community. I confronted Kathy, questioning her decision to engage in such behavior while I was away at war. She acknowledged her wrongdoing and admitted to feeling confused and longing for my presence. Despite my absence, she continued, Donald's company provided her with enjoyment and helped alleviate her feelings of loneliness. Kathy confessed to the increasing frequency of their outings, acknowledging the closeness that developed between them. As the affair progressed, Kathy confessed, they began seeing each other 2 or 3 times a week. One evening, after a romantic dinner, Donald invited her back to his place, and despite her initial hesitation, she agreed. Kathy recounted feeling remorseful afterward and insisted that Donald take her home. After ending things with Donald and expressing her love for me, Kathy admitted to reconsidering her decision. Donald, she recounted sadly, had left her alone for some time before reaching out to express his longing for her companionship. He assured her that he missed her and wished to see her again, but only as friends. He apologized for their previous actions and promised not to put her in a compromising situation again. Despite her initial resolve, Kathy confessed that she agreed to see Donald again. The following weekend, Kathy recounted, Donald took her to an unfaithful party at a friend's home on the Bluffs. She described it as a small gathering with only 5 or 6 couples, all of whom were influential individuals in the town. During the event, Kathy was caught off guard when the wife of a prominent doctor inquired about how she managed to capture Donald's attention. Unable to think of a suitable response, Kathy admitted to fabricating a story about being separated from her husband and going through a divorce. The news about Kathy's fabricated separation and impending divorce quickly spread throughout the small town, causing Kathy to feel trapped. During a weekend when our daughter Stacy was away, Kathy spent time with Donald at his home, leading to their ongoing relationship. Kathy expressed deep regret for the pain she caused me and Stacy, acknowledging that her actions were the worst mistake of her life and that she wished she could undo them. However, she admitted that undoing the damage was impossible. When asked about her feelings for Donald, Kathy admitted uncertainty about whether she loved him, but acknowledged enjoying their time together. Despite my probing questions about their closeness and the possibility of marriage, Kathy remained unsure about the future of their relationship. The doorbell rang, and I suggested that it might be for Kathy. She approached the door slowly and confirmed her identity when handed a manila envelope which contained divorce papers. Kathy stood at the door for a while, visibly upset, before closing it and turning to me, tears streaming down her face, She asked if our relationship was truly over, to which I affirmed. Despite her declaration of love, I countered that what she loved was the life we had, which she had discarded. I informed her that our daughter, Stacy, would stay with my mother until my deployment ended. Kathy broke down in tears, overwhelmed with regret. The following day, the front page of the local newspaper displayed a picture with a headline questioning the identity of a married woman leaving a hotel room with Mayor Connolly. The photo showed Kathy and the mayor kissing as they exited room 1114, accompanied by a caption questioning whether her husband, serving in Afghanistan, was aware of the situation. The article described the charity event attended by the pair, and hotel records confirming the mayor's reservation of the room for the night. Additionally, the couple was photographed leaving the room at 2 a.m. The article also mentioned unverified rumors of regular meetings over the past 6 months between the woman and the mayor while her husband was deployed in Afghanistan. The newspaper asserted its editorial right to bring the story to light, given the man's stature and the offense against a soldier stationed in Damage's Way, causing a significant uproar. Within minutes of the story reaching people's doorsteps, the mayor's office entered damage control, asserting the story was entirely fabricated. They claimed Mayor Connolly would never jeopardize any marriage, especially that of a soldier serving his country overseas. They contended that the photograph was an obvious fake, attributing the situation to unnamed sinister individuals targeting the mayor. A promised press conference later that afternoon aimed to set the record straight. Unfortunately, over the past 6 months, too many people had seen Connolly and Kathy together, displaying affection in public. One by one, his friends and supporters began distancing themselves. Several people anonymously phoned the newspaper to confess they knew for a fact that the couple had been having an affair because they'd witnessed it on more than one occasion, expressing outrage to discover that the woman's husband was deployed in the army while the affair was taking place. That afternoon, Mayor Connolly held his news conference, but none of his friends on the city council stood by him. In fact, the only people backing him up were his staff, and even half of them were strangely missing. The newspaper and TV stations were present, recording the entire event. As Connolly expressed horror at being accused of such an unthinkable thing, he assured everyone that he and the woman were merely acquaintances and had never done anything to bring shame upon them or the woman's husband. Halfway through his speech, Kathy pushed her way through the onlookers and reached the microphone. In an act of defiance, Kathy revealed her identity, stating, "My name is Kathy Crawford. I am the wife of Army Major Robert Crawford, and for the past 6 months, I have been having an affair with Mayor Connolly." Connolly tried to dismiss her, claiming he didn't know her and calling her a liar. Kathy confronted him, expressing shame and heartbreak, accusing him of pursuing her despite knowing she was married and her husband was in Afghanistan. Tearfully, she apologized to her husband through the TV cameras and left while reporters bombarded the mayor with questions. He turned and stormed back into City Hall. I must confess that exposing all of that to the world damaged my already fragile ego. However, I was aware of the risk I was taking when I approached John Foster, my newspaper contact, the next day. This occurred when the president of the city council announced the mayor's resignation and declared that the council would govern the city until a new mayoral election could be held. While I should have felt satisfaction, all I experienced was a profound, empty loneliness. Loneliness consumed me, and I missed my wife more than I had ever thought possible. That afternoon, my reporter friend called to inform me that Connolly had packed up and left town without leaving a forwarding address, and my soon-to-be ex-wife hadn't accompanied him. During the remaining days of my leave, I spent as much time as possible with my daughter. In the last week, I allowed Kathy to move back into the house. Stacy and I traveled to my mother's home 60 miles away, where I enrolled her in school, promising to return and get her as soon as my deployment was over. The following week, I was on a plane back to Afghanistan, my heart filled with burning anger that I intended to unleash on the enemy lurking in the desert. What happened to Kathy? A few weeks later, she moved in with Connolly, and they too departed from town. Did Robert return from Afghanistan? Yes, but he suffered critical injuries, and his daughter assisted him in getting back on his feet. He lost one of his legs in an ambush. Currently, he works as a design specialist for a large electronics firm, residing with his daughter. Occasionally, he speaks about the challenges faced by soldiers who have served duty outside the country.
Story 3.
Brian's journey had always been marked by dedication and hard work. Growing up in a modest household, he learned the value of perseverance from his father, who worked tirelessly to provide for the family. Those lessons stayed with Brian as he built a life for himself, climbing the ranks in his career while remaining a devoted father and husband. Despite his efforts, life wasn't without its challenges. Over the years, Brian found himself juggling the demands of his job at Harding Containers with the responsibilities of raising a family. Balancing late-night shifts and weekend projects often left him exhausted, but he took pride in his ability to provide for his wife and son. He had always believed that hard work and loyalty were the keys to maintaining a happy home. Brian Welker's face lit up as he brushed away the beads of sweat from his forehead. Earlier that day, he received exciting news. He had been promoted to shift supervisor at Harding Containers, with the new role taking effect immediately. As if the promotion wasn't enough, he was assigned to the night shift, a schedule many avoided but one that suited Brian perfectly. For Brian, the timing couldn't have been better. His teenage son, a high school junior, was deeply involved in sports and extracurricular activities. By working nights, Brian would have the freedom to attend his son's events without compromising his job. He was no stranger to the challenges of a nocturnal schedule, having worked similar shifts in the past. Over the years, he had mastered the art of adapting his sleep routine to daytime hours, making the transition manageable. That explained why Brian found himself crawling through the trusses of his attic on a sweltering August afternoon. With Thursday and Friday off to prepare for his new responsibilities, he decided to use the time to ready himself for the job, which officially started Sunday night. Brian had been planning to transform the area above his detached garage into a cozy studio apartment. He envisioned it as a tranquil hideaway where he could rest during the day without disruptions. He was determined to avoid the typical disturbances that often come with trying to sleep while the rest of the world is bustling. One of his tasks involved running an internet cable to the new space. The Wi-Fi signal from the main house didn't reach the garage, so Brian decided to install a signal extender in the attic closest to the garage, hoping it would provide a strong connection in his future retreat. As he stretched out in the attic, carefully unwinding the cable, he heard faint noises coming from somewhere inside the house. The sounds puzzled him, as the house should have been empty. His wife, Brenda, was working, and their son, Tim, was away visiting her parents for a few days. Intrigued, Brian began moving toward the source of the noise. After creeping about 15 feet closer, he pinpointed the origin. It was coming from the master bedroom. The muffled voices became clearer as he positioned himself above an unused air vent in the bedroom ceiling. Years ago, Brenda had complained that the vent blew cold air directly onto her, which she believed contributed to persistent neck pain. To resolve the issue, Brian had installed a new vent on the opposite side of the room. Rather than remove the old one and patch the ceiling, he had simply left it in place, disconnected from any ductwork. He carefully peeled back the layer of fiberglass insulation that covered the attic floor, exposing the old vent underneath. What he saw through the slats made his stomach churn. His wife of 2 decades entwined with a slender man whose pale, almost glowing skin stood out starkly in the dim light. The scene before him was like a slow-motion disaster, horrifying yet impossible to look away from. Brian found himself frozen, watching the wreckage of what had once been his marriage unfold. The two had been locked in their passionate encounter for several minutes before Brian's shock began to dissipate, and his mind kicked into gear. With steady hands, he pulled out his phone, switched to video mode, and carefully positioned it on the vent. The angle provided a clear, uninterrupted view of the bed where his trust had just been shattered. "Does your husband ever tap this prime kitty? Or does he have a needle Johnson?" the man teased smugly. "I've told you before not to bring up Brian," Brenda replied, though her tone lacked conviction in Brian's view. "This isn't about him. He's a good husband, a wonderful father, and a great partner in every way." "Oh, I'm sure he is," the man responded with a chuckle, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Yet here we are in his bed, and you're insisting you're perfectly satisfied with what he offers. Don't you see how ridiculous that sounds?" Brian couldn't fathom why he'd let himself be persuaded into this. "Why here of all places?" "Ah, right there!" Brenda's groan pierced the room. "There's no risk in your apartment. I'm going to come." Her lover stiffened, his body rigid, before rolling off her with a satisfied sigh. For a moment, the room was silent. "You feel the rush now?" he teased, catching his breath. "Sure, my apartment works fine, but doing it in your own bed? That's next-level thrill." Brian recognized him immediately. Bill Grant, a divorced delivery driver from their shared workplace. His daughter even went to school with their son, Tim. Brenda sounded distant. "This is messed up," she said flatly. "You get off on this, don't you? Like it's some twisted game. Sleeping with me in Brian's bed?" Grant chuckled softly. "It is a game, at least for men. The closeness is amazing, but knowing I'm doing it in your husband's bed, that makes me the winner." Her tone grew sharper. "You'd feel less like a winner if Brian caught us. I can't believe I agreed to this. It's not happening again. I don't want to destroy my marriage." Grant smirked. "Fine. Keep him out of the bedroom and I won't push for the bed. But if he gets back between your legs, I'll need to reclaim my spot." Brenda hesitated. "I'm not cutting him off completely. He's my husband, but I'll discourage him as much as I can. I can't even imagine what he'd do if he found out." Brian had heard every word from the attic. He'd come home early, parking in the garage out of sight. Sweat poured off him as he lay motionless, listening to the pair dress and leave. His stomach churned, but he resisted the urge to vomit. Cleaning up wasn't an option, not here. Descending the ladder, Brian's thoughts churned. His wife was sleeping with another man in their home, in their bed. She was even planning to deny him intimacy to keep her affair going. The realization stung, but it also gave him clarity. In the shower, he reached a decision. Brenda didn't know he'd uncovered her betrayal, and he intended to keep it that way. With Tim still in high school for 2 more years, his son became Brian's sole priority. Brenda? She no longer mattered. Why should he care for someone who clearly held him in such disregard? Leaving wasn't an option. He'd invested years remodeling their house and wasn't about to hand it over to some creep. Brenda hadn't mentioned divorce, so he'd stick it out until Tim graduated. In the meantime, he needed his separate space, a sanctuary. His small apartment above the garage, once a place to nap between shifts, would now become his home. A full kitchen, a bathroom upgrade, whatever it took to make it livable. Brian made calls to contractors, determined to finish the space quickly and professionally. His promotion afforded him the luxury of outsourcing the work. For the first time, he realized his time was worth more than saving a few dollars. Every penny saved would only be split with Brenda in the end. The betrayal had shattered his old mindset. Brian resolved to focus on Tim's future and rebuild his own life. Brenda's affair had freed him from any lingering loyalty. By the time Brenda returned that evening, Brian had regained his composure. She paused in surprise upon seeing him at the kitchen table. "You're home early. Did something happen?" He glanced at her, noticing details he'd never observed before. The fine lines, the slight weight gain. Had love blinded him to these imperfections? It saddened him to feel so detached, but the choice to cheat had been hers. "I got asked to switch to night shifts for a while," he replied evenly. "They let me come home to rest before I head back in." "That's awful. You'll burn out working a double," she fretted. "At least try to nap for a bit." Brian nodded. "Good idea. I'll just crawl into bed and—" "Wait!" Brenda blurted out, panic flashing across her face. I just remembered. I need to wash the sheets." Brian's expression remained calm, though inside he relished her discomfort. "No problem. I'll use the guest room. No need to worry yourself." As he walked away, Brenda stood frozen, her panic unspoken. Brian smirked grimly to himself. Let her squirm. He had plans of his own now, and she wasn't part of them. A few hours later, Brian left the house, pretending to head to work. Instead, he stopped at a sports bar, enjoyed a baseball game, and had a couple of beers. When he was sure Brenda was asleep, he returned home, parking in the garage and slipping upstairs to the air mattress he'd prepared in his unfinished apartment. He slept surprisingly well. The next morning, one of the contractors he'd contacted offered a discounted rate to start immediately due to an upcoming project. Brian agreed without hesitation, signing the contract for work to begin Monday. That evening, Brian opted to sleep in the guest room, citing his need to adjust to night shifts. Brenda appeared unsettled by his choice, but Brian brushed it off. Over the weekend, he spent time with Tim, did yard work, and continued sleeping in the guest room, further confusing Brenda. On Sunday night, Brian began his first shift as foreman. He hadn't mentioned the promotion to Brenda, feeling no obligation to share details with someone who had been keeping secrets from him. The transition to his new role went smoothly, and he was pleased with his team's competence. Monday morning brought the start of construction on his apartment. After briefly discussing the plans with the crew, Brian went to bed in the guest room, though construction noise and an ill-timed call from his mother-in-law interrupted his sleep. Annoyed, he unplugged the phone and eventually fell back asleep. By the end of the week, the renovations were complete. Brian was impressed with how quickly the contractors had transformed the space. It was a far cry from his previous do-it-yourself approach, which would have taken months. That afternoon, he ordered furniture, appliances, and a TV to fully outfit the apartment. By Monday, everything would be in place, and his newly finished apartment, his personal refuge, would be ready to occupy. For the first time, Brian felt like he was regaining control of his life. When Brenda arrived home Monday and saw a crew working on the garage, she was visibly puzzled. Brian was chatting with the foreman, but she insisted they step aside so he could explain. Brian revealed he was converting the space above the garage into an apartment, fully insulated to block noise and without a landline. It would serve as a quiet retreat while he adjusted to working night shifts. He assured her it wouldn't affect family time, as he still planned to attend Tim's baseball games and have dinner with them. Brenda, unsettled by the arrangement, questioned Brian's intentions, but he dismissed her concerns. Their conversation turned tense when Brian made sarcastic remarks about intimacy, brushing off her frustrations. Brenda lashed out, demanding an apology and a proper date if he wanted to reconcile. Brian responded with a smile and walked away, leaving her confused. His dismissive attitude worried Brenda. He had always been attentive, but now he seemed distant and indifferent. By Wednesday, Brian had fully moved into his new apartment, just in time for the long Labor Day weekend. At dinner Thursday, he suggested taking Tim to a Diamondbacks game against the Dodgers. Tim was thrilled, but Brenda declined, claiming she didn't enjoy baseball. Brian casually remarked that she'd find something else to do at home, a comment that didn't go unnoticed. Encouraged by Tim's excitement, Brian suggested inviting Tim's friend Scooter to join them. Tim eagerly called Scooter, who quickly got permission from his mom. Brenda used the opportunity to mention that Scooter, whose real name was Horace, had recently moved to the area with his widowed mother to be closer to her ailing parents. Brian was amused by the boy's nickname and decided to stick with it. On Saturday, Tim drove to Scooter's house to pick him up. Scooter ran out to the truck but mentioned his mom wanted to meet Brian first. Apologizing for the inconvenience, Scooter led Brian to the door. Brian, unfazed, rang the bell and prepared to make a good impression. The excitement for the game was palpable, setting the tone for a bonding experience Brian intended to enjoy fully with his son. When Brian knocked on Scooter's door, it was opened by a slender woman around his age, casually dressed in running shorts and a tank top. Her strong, shapely legs immediately caught his attention, though he tried to remain discreet. To his surprise, Scooter's mom caught him off guard with a cheeky comment about her legs being her best feature. Embarrassed but amused, Brian admitted they looked great. She playfully scolded him for being so obvious and teased that she was raising her son to be a gentleman, not someone who ogled women. Recognizing her humor, Brian leaned into the banter, joking about teaching Scooter to appreciate women properly while also learning how to judge subtly. Their lighthearted exchange continued until she introduced herself as Gertrude. Brian laughed at her formal name and insisted on calling her Minx, much to her amusement. As they chatted, she shared that she loved baseball and came from a family of fans. Her father had even played minor league ball. Pleased with their interaction, she gave Scooter permission to join Brian and Tim for the game, praising Tim as a polite young man. At the game, the three had a fantastic time. Scooter caught a foul ball, and both boys indulged in too many hot dogs and sodas. On the way home, they fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted but happy. When they reached Scooter's house, Brian helped the groggy boy to the door, where Gertrude greeted them with a smile. She thanked Brian for taking Scooter and laughed when Brian confessed they had overindulged on ballpark snacks. Before leaving, Brian called Scooter a great kid, sticking to his nickname for Gertrude, much to her amusement. Brian soon settled into a routine. His new apartment over the garage became his private sanctuary, and he slept soundly there, thanks to the noise-proofing and blackout curtains. Brenda occasionally complained about him staying in the man cave even on weekends, but she dropped the topic whenever Brian teasingly asked if she needed his services. He suspected her real concern was keeping her affair hidden and avoiding any confrontation. Her hesitation to press for divorce reassured Brian that his plan to remain married until Tim's graduation was still on track. With his new role as foreman leaving him less physically active, Brian invested in a home gym and committed to regular workouts, which proved effective. He stayed involved in Tim's life, attending all his baseball practices and games. Before long, the coach asked Brian to help train small groups of players. Tim showed steady improvement and became a reliable center fielder, but Scooter's transformation impressed Brian the most. Initially timid, Scooter blossomed under Brian's guidance, growing more confident and skilled. They spent weekends practicing together, which gave Brian a positive outlet for his energy. By mid-season, Scooter was batting cleanup and excelling at shortstop, While Tim held his spot as the team's third batter and center fielder, Brian was immensely proud of both boys and enjoyed his role in their success. He also noticed the growing attention from some of the other players' mothers. His humor seemed to resonate with them, and they often complimented his efforts with the kids. Occasionally, they brought baked goods for the team, ensuring Brian got a share. Though he remained focused on his priorities, Brian couldn't help but feel a small sense of validation from the camaraderie and recognition. Tim's growing friendship with Scooter naturally led to more time spent between their parents, Brian and Gertrude. Their interactions developed into an easy camaraderie, with Gertrude's humor and intelligence standing out to Brian. One afternoon, while the kids played, Brian decided to broach a subject that had been on his mind. He asked Gertrude if she'd noticed the other moms being unusually friendly lately. Gertrude's playful wit surfaced as she jokingly misinterpreted his question, deflecting with humor before explaining. She pointed out that the women showing him extra attention were single mothers. Brian was, in their eyes, an ideal prospect, a good father, an attractive man, and financially stable. However, she clarified that his marital status likely kept them from making direct moves, at least for now. The conversation took a serious turn when Gertrude revealed a piece of gossip. Many of the mothers knew about Brenda's affair. Even more troubling was the rumor that Brenda had cut Brian off from intimacy entirely. According to Gertrude, it was common knowledge among the group that Brian's marriage was on the rocks, and the single mom saw him as a soon-to-be free agent. Brian was shocked. The idea that his private struggles were so publicly known angered him. It didn't take long for him to figure out the source. Brenda must have shared details with her lover, who likely boasted to someone else. He vented his frustration to Gertrude, admitting he'd caught Brenda and her lover Grant in the act. Despite the betrayal, Brian had decided to stay married for Tim's sake, moving into his garage apartment to avoid unnecessary conflict. Brian further explained his arrangement. Living apart but under the same roof allowed him to be a constant presence in Tim's life. He told Gertrude about Brenda's reaction when Grant insisted she avoid intimacy with Brian or risk their affair being exposed. Brian, however, had no intention of engaging with Brenda, citing concerns for his health and self-respect. A recent STD test had come back clean, and he intended to keep it that way. Gertrude was furious on Brian's behalf, expressing her disbelief at how he'd been treated. She assured him that many of the mothers admired him not just for his looks, but for his dedication to his son and his good-natured personality. Brian downplayed her compliments, but Gertrude insisted, adding a self-deprecating joke about her own perceived shortcomings. Brian appreciated her honesty and thanked her for being upfront about the rumors. Still, he admitted feeling humiliated knowing others viewed him as a loser. Gertrude countered, praising his strength for enduring the situation to prioritize his relationship with Tim. She warned him, however, that Tim had started noticing the strain at home. It was only a matter of time before the boy pieced together the truth. As they continued talking, Gertrude confided her own worries. Scooter had developed a crush on Heather Grant, Grant's daughter. While Heather was a kind girl unaware of her father's behavior, the situation added an awkward layer for both her and Scooter. Brian, relieved that Tim wasn't entangled with Heather, joked about being grateful for small favors. Instead, Gertrude mentioned, Tim seemed interested in Holly Ingram, a girl who attended every game and cheered for him enthusiastically. Brian acknowledged Holly's presence, remembering her family fondly from his own school days. It was a bittersweet moment, highlighting both the challenges of his current reality and the silver linings that kept him focused on what truly mattered, Tim's happiness and future. Here's a rewritten version of the text, preserving the original word count and essence while fully rephrasing it. A couple of evenings later, Tim's team competed in the opening round of the district playoffs. As the game approached, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that he was more anxious than Tim. Adding to his unease, the usual trio of single moms seemed particularly intent on drawing his attention. Norma Wilson had opted for a top that left little to the imagination, exposing a generous amount of her cleavage. She seemed to find countless reasons to bend over in front of Brian, whether to retrieve something or pretend to search for an item. Brian couldn't deny that her display was striking. Brandy Dorn took a different approach, wearing a form-fitting sweater that accentuated her toned waist and flat stomach, while subtly highlighting her firm curves. She peppered Brian with questions about the team and its players, keeping him engaged. Jillian Patterson, on the other hand, was much less discreet. She stood so close to Brian that her ample chest frequently brushed against his arm or side. Nearby, Gertrude shot him a knowing smirk as she handed him a hot dog and soda before heading back to her seat near first base. Brian noticed that, oddly, all three women left his immediate area at the same time. He was puzzled until he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Well, I thought I'd join my husband to watch my son play today." "I didn't realize I'd have to navigate through a crowd of admirers to find him," Brenda announced, her tone louder than necessary. "Care to explain, Brian?" "The game hasn't started yet, but Tim looked sharp during batting practice," Brian replied, hoping to steer the conversation elsewhere. "Nice try," Brenda snapped. "Why were those women circling you like vultures? Good thing you don't seem to have a silicone allergy." "If you're asking me to explain their behavior, I'm just as clueless as you are," Brian admitted. "Honestly, I'm surprised to see you here." "My son is playing a big game. Of course I'm here. It's important to him, so it's important to me. Not to mention, it's a chance to spend some time together cheering him on," Brenda reasoned, though her expression tightened when Brian brought up her obligations. For a fleeting moment, Brenda wondered if Brian was insinuating something. She quickly dismissed the thought. If he suspected anything, he'd have confronted her in a far more direct and heated manner. One thing she knew for certain was that Brian would never tolerate infidelity without making it unmistakably clear. Brenda and Brian found seats in the bleachers. As they settled in, Brenda noticed some of the other mothers shooting her unfriendly glances. This puzzled her. She had no prior interaction with any of them, having missed every game so far. What could she have done to upset them? Her gaze landed on Gertrude, who sat slightly apart from the group. While Gertrude typically faded into the background, today her neatly styled hair and toned legs, shown off by slightly too short shorts given the chilly weather, caught Brenda's eye. The game kicked off, drawing Brian's full attention. The first two batters struck out before Tim stepped into the batter's box. Brenda's nerves spiked when the pitcher's first throw whizzed past Tim's head. The second pitch was outside, but Tim connected solidly, sending the ball sailing over first base for a stand-up double. The next batter, Scooter, stepped up, exuding strength and confidence. Scooter narrowly avoided being hit by the first pitch, which zipped dangerously close to his head. Brenda heard Brian chuckle as the boy prepared for the next throw. "Trying to intimidate those two is a mistake," Brian remarked to the nearby spectators. "I hope the pitcher tries a fastball." As the pitcher wound up, the crowd held its breath. He delivered a blazing fastball, but Scooter met it with a loud crack of the bat. Gasps and cheers erupted as the ball soared over the center field fence. Tim crossed home plate and waited to exchange high fives with Scooter. Gertrude beamed with pride as her son rounded the bases. She glanced at Brian and saw tears glistening on his cheeks. His countless hours spent coaching Tim and Scooter had paid off, and his pride was palpable. She was deeply grateful for Brian's mentorship, which had played a vital role in shaping her son's growth into a fine young man. Later, Brenda drove to a pizza place where the team was celebrating their victory. Finding a parking spot far from the entrance, she hurried inside only to see Norma and Brandy hovering too close to Brian. Their ample figures frequently brushed against him as he sorted out drinks for the boys. Here's the rewritten version of the text, rephrased and paraphrased while preserving the original word count. Brenda wasn't surprised to see the two women scatter as she neared. Their retreat triggered memories of a conversation she'd had with her lover, Bill Grant, just 2 weeks earlier. "Don't you think it's about time we take things to your bed?" Bill had pressed, as Brenda slipped back into her clothes after one of their secret encounters. "The idea of being with you in your husband's bed drives me wild." "I told you we wouldn't do that again until Brian and I have been together," Brenda reminded him firmly. "It's too risky otherwise." "Wait, you're telling me you still haven't slept with your husband since we did it at your house?" Bill asked, his disbelief evident. "You said you'd hold out as long as you could, but I didn't expect him to stay celibate this long. Hasn't he even tried?" Brenda sighed. "He went on the night shift that same day, and now he sleeps in the room over the garage. Honestly, we haven't even hugged since." "That's insane," Bill shot back. "There's no way a guy his age wouldn't be interested in intimacy, especially with a wife as gorgeous as you." "Is he gay, or does he have someone on the side?" "He's definitely not gay," Brenda insisted. "Brian is as straight as they come, and he would never cheat on me. He's just tired all the time from work. We only see each other at dinner. And even then, just on weekdays. Weekends are for yard work." "No way. A man with a wife like you wouldn't voluntarily go without intimacy, no matter how exhausted he is," Bill declared. "If he's getting some action elsewhere, then it works out better for us. He has his fun, and I get what used to be his." "Brian would never betray me," Brenda said, her voice resolute. He takes our marriage vows seriously. That's just not who he is. Bill raised an eyebrow. And what do you think this is, Brenda? Well, this is different, she explained, trying to justify herself. It's just temporary. He's been so preoccupied with work and Tim's baseball games that he's barely noticed me. I deserve to have a little fun, too. I work full-time, keep the house in order, and handle the meals. This isn't forever, Bill smirked. Fair enough. Let's enjoy it while it lasts. Now, tell me when I can have you in your bed. It's such a turn-on. Brenda pushed the memory away as she watched the women who had been hovering around Brian fade into the background. It was obvious they were interested in him, too interested, in fact. Seeing their retreat only deepened her resolve to protect her marriage from their advances. Spotting Gertrude sitting alone, Brenda quickly formulated a plan. She plastered on a friendly smile and sat next to a startled Gertrude. It's so nice to see you again. Horace has turned into a fantastic player, and he's such a polite young man. You must be so proud. I am, Gertrude admitted cautiously. Tim's been doing great, too. All the time Brian has spent working with them has really paid off. He's been an incredible mentor to Horace. Brian is too good sometimes, Brenda replied, seizing her chance. I'm sure you've noticed how those busty blondes are constantly throwing themselves at him. I was hoping you might be able to help me out. Gertrude raised an eyebrow. And what exactly would that involve? Should I spray them with water when they get too close? Brenda chuckled awkwardly. Not quite. I can't make it to most games or practices because of work. And I know I can trust you to keep an eye on him. You're not his type. If you could stick close to him when I'm not around, it would mean a lot. And how exactly would that work? Gertrude asked skeptically. I'll tell Brian he should stay near you and act more engaged. Those women will think he's with you and hopefully back off. It might feel a bit awkward for you, but it's for a good cause. You'd be helping to protect my marriage. Gertrude stared at her in disbelief. So let me get this straight. You're worried these closenessy single moms might seduce your husband, so you want me to pretend to be his stand-in wife when you're not around? Because you think I'm safe. What with being flat-chested and all? I didn't say you were plain, Brenda protested. I just know Brian. He wouldn't go for you over someone with cheerleader vibes. You'd be doing me a huge favor. Gertrude's tone turned serious. You really think cheating is the ultimate deal breaker? Absolutely, Brenda said firmly. It's a violation of trust. If Brian ever cheated, our marriage would be over. You were married. You must understand that. I do, Gertrude agreed. Fidelity is key to a healthy relationship. Satisfied, Brenda asked, So, can I count on you to help me out? Gertrude smiled faintly. Sure. Just make sure Brian knows what's going on. I'll do my part. After all, who better to ward off temptation than a boring, flat-chested single mom? That's not how I'd put it, but you get the idea, Brenda said, heading off to join her husband. The next day, Brian spoke up at practice. Brenda had a chat with me last night. She's convinced there are too many flirty moms hanging around and thinks I should stick close to you, Gertrude, or, as she calls you, safe. Why doesn't that make me feel safer? Smart man, Gertrude quipped. You're never safe around a single woman, no matter how plain she looks. You're one of the most beautiful women I know, Brian replied sincerely. It's not about looks or silicone. It's about the whole person. Gertrude blushed. Great. Now you've made my job even harder. Brian grinned. You'll see. I've got perfect vision. It's my judgment of character that might need a second look. And I think your wife may have misjudged us, Gertrude added, smiling softly. Here's the rewritten and paraphrased version of the text, maintaining the original word count and core essence while completely rephrasing it. Brian couldn't help but chuckle at the reactions of the single mothers when Gertrude, or Minx, as he'd started calling her, stayed by his side during practice. They exchanged playful banter and jokes, and the disappointment among the other women was almost tangible. In less than one practice, Minx had effectively separated him from the crowd of admirers. The next game required a 3-hour trip to Middleburg, so the team planned to travel the day before and stay overnight at a hotel. The goal was to ensure the boys were well rested for the big day. Brian offered to drive Jake Winston's parents along with Minx, and the conversation on the way revolved around the team's chances of making it through districts and possibly to the state championship. They arrived shortly after the team bus pulled into the hotel. As Brian helped Ralph Winston unload his luggage, he noted that the Winstons, like a few other parents, were staying at the same hotel as the team to assist as chaperones. The other parents had booked rooms elsewhere since the town was packed with players and fans attending multiple games. 6 teams were competing, making hotel space scarce. Before Tim boarded the bus earlier, Brian had reminded his son that he'd be staying at a different hotel. He also made it clear Tim needed to behave and follow the chaperone's rules. "I'll see you at practice in the morning," Brian reassured him. As the Winstons wheeled their bags into the team's hotel, Brian turned to Gertrude. "So, where are you staying, Minx?" "Same place as you," she said simply. Brian frowned. "I didn't tell you which hotel I booked. How'd you figure it out?" "I didn't," she replied with a sly smile. "Then how do you know we're at the same place? It's a busy weekend. What if you can't find a room?" Brian asked, clearly puzzled. "Oh, I'm sure I'll manage," she answered with a grin that left him even more confused. When they reached Brian's hotel a few minutes later, he suggested, "Why don't you check if there's a room available while I get checked in? I can wait and make sure you find something." "Thanks, but I'm fine waiting here," she replied confidently. As Brian finished checking in and collected his room keys, a realization began to dawn on him. Returning to the truck, he handed Minx one of the access cards. "Want to share the room? It's 207. "How thoughtful of you," she exclaimed, taking the key with a grin and planting a kiss on his cheek. "Let's head up. It's going to be a long night." When Brian woke up the next morning, he felt more exhausted than when he'd gone to bed. Breaking his marriage vows had been a moral battle at first, but Minx had guided him through the guilt with her logical approach. "Let's be honest, Brian," she had said. "Brenda hasn't just cheated on you. She's completely cut you off. Even if she hadn't, she's risking your health by having unprotected love with a reckless man. She's made intimacy with her unsafe and undesirable. By her actions, she's effectively released you from your vows." Minx had continued, "I haven't been with anyone in over 2 years, and I've had a clean bill of health from regular checkups. You're clean too. Didn't you get tested after you found out about Brenda's affair? Plus, I've been on the pill for over a month in case we got the chance to be together." Then her tone softened. "Can you give me one good reason we shouldn't be together? Is it because you don't find me attractive? Your wife thought I was the safest choice to fend off those other women because she assumed you'd never be interested in me." "Minx, don't ever think that," Brian had reassured her. "You're incredibly desirable. I've never cheated on Brenda before, so this is an adjustment, but I'm ready." Her response surprised him. "There's something you should know first. Both my parents are in hospice and won't be around much longer. My brother has been sending game footage of Horace to a baseball coach at a top prep school in LA. If he gets a scholarship, we'll likely move back next year." She added, "I like you a lot, Brian, but this isn't something that can last. You're a married man with a cheating wife, and I'm just a single mom trying to do what's best for my son." Brian nodded, trying to focus on the bright side. "That's incredible news for Scooter. He's a talented player, and this is a great opportunity for him to compete at a higher level and get a good education." "It's ironic, isn't it?" Minx said. "Your mentorship helped him improve so much that we're now considering leaving town. In a way, you've made this possible." Brian hesitated. "I don't think I'm cut out for a one-night stand. It might be better to skip this altogether than have one night and then go back to being celibate." "You're overthinking it," she teased. "We're talking about 6 months before anything changes. That's plenty of time for a lot of fun. Unless, of course, you're too old to handle it." Brian smirked. "We'll see about that. Will you live up to your nickname, Minx?" "For you? Absolutely," she quipped. "Whenever you need me, just whistle." "I've been told my whistling is pretty good," Brian joked. "Then you're definitely doing it wrong," she shot back with a wink. The baseball team secured the state championship, and Scooter received a scholarship to an esteemed prep school in California. Around Thanksgiving, Gertrude faced the loss of both her parents, who passed away within days of each other. Brian and Tim attended the funerals, where Brian met Gertrude's brother, Dexter. Dexter, though formally addressed by his family, preferred the nickname Grim and seemed to share an immediate camaraderie with Brian. Thanksgiving brought Brian to Brenda's parents' home, a long-standing tradition. That night, he found himself sharing a room with Brenda, as they always stayed over. Brenda initiated intimacy for the first time in months, suggesting they rekindle their physical relationship. Brian's response, laced with sarcasm, led to tension instead. While it achieved his goal of avoiding any intimacy with her, it also highlighted the cracks in their marriage. Brenda, unsettled by his tone, lay awake, questioning whether Brian suspected her affair or was simply frustrated by their lack of connection. The situation prompted her to reconsider the risky dynamics of her arrangement with Bill, especially as it pertained to her marital bed. Meanwhile, Brian had established a routine with his new night shift schedule. His mornings began with breakfast before heading to bed. Often, he would wake around mid-afternoon to find Gertrude, whom he fondly called Minx, joining him. They would spend an hour together before she returned home to be there when Scooter finished school. This arrangement gave Brian time to prepare for Tim's return and allowed him to rest before starting work again. With baseball season over, the schedule worked seamlessly for both. In early December, Brian's work night was interrupted by a call from Tim. He learned that Tim, Scooter, and their friends, Heather and Holly, were stranded on D Street with a flat tire and no spare. Heather's car, a Corolla, had broken down near a sketchy arcade, leaving the group feeling uneasy. Brian, alarmed by their location, promised to resolve the issue. At work, Brian approached Gus, a colleague who also owned a Corolla. Gus offered to lend a mounted spare tire and suggested they use his car to get there quickly. Brian enlisted Jack, Holly's uncle, to join them, knowing he'd want to ensure Holly's safety. The three men set off, concerned about the group of teenagers in such a questionable area at night. At the same time, Brenda was enjoying the aftermath of her time with Bill when his phone rang. The call was from Heather, but Bill dismissed the situation as unimportant, advising her to call roadside assistance instead. Brenda overheard enough to sense unease, but chose not to press him for details. When Brian, Gus, and Jack arrived on D Street, a group of young men was loitering near Heather's car. Brian quickly retrieved the jack and tools while Gus carried the spare tire. Jack checked on the teenagers, instructing them to stay inside the car while they worked. The presence of the men brought an additional layer of tension, but the adults remained focused on the task. As Brian began loosening the lug nuts, the leader of the group approached Jack. He asserted a claim over the area, warning that they needed his permission to proceed. The situation was tense, but Brian, Gus, and Jack were determined to ensure the safety of the teenagers and resolve the problem efficiently. Before Jack had the chance to reply, Brian swung the tire iron and slammed it into the man's shins. The guy collapsed to his knees, groaning and clutching his legs while unleashing a string of expletives. Without hesitation, Brian grabbed the man by the collar, dragged him face down next to the flat tire, and pinned him to the ground by sitting on his back. Calmly, he resumed loosening the lug nuts. Two gang members rushed in to help their fallen leader, but Jack intercepted the first one with a sharp blow to the side of his head, dropping him instantly. As Gus stepped up, the second attacker quickly retreated, keeping a safe distance. "Jack, raise the car so I can swap out this tire," Brian said with a steady voice. Jack cranked the jack higher, while the gang shouted insults and threats. Occasionally, the pinned man tried to wriggle free, but Brian would yank his greasy hair, lift his head slightly, and push it back down with force. After two such reminders, the man decided to stay still. Brian removed the flat tire and slid on the replacement that Gus handed him. After securing the lug nuts by hand, Jack lowered the car. The gang members kept taunting, but the three men ignored them. As Brian tightened the nuts, he accidentally stepped on the leader's groin while walking over him. "Are you idiots talking to us?" Brian asked, tossing the tire iron between his hands as he advanced toward the gang. The group scattered immediately, unwilling to face him. "You kids better scram!" Jack shouted as Brian herded the gang further from the car. "And watch out for those fools lying in the street on your way out. Stay out of this neighborhood." The three men got back into Gus's car and followed Heather as she led them out of the area toward the kids' homes. Gus chuckled as they drove. "I can't believe you cracked that guy in the shins. He went down like a sack of bricks." "Thanks for letting me come along," Jack added with a laugh. "My hand's sore, but it felt great taking that guy down." "And then you sat on him while changing the tire," Gus howled. "That was gold." They were still laughing and swapping stories when they returned to work. By the next morning, the tale had spread through the plant, becoming a favorite among the night shift workers. It was exactly the kind of excitement that made the long hours pass more quickly. Later that afternoon, Brian was waking up when Minx jumped into bed with him. Without clothes and eager, she kissed him passionately. "Horace told me what happened last night. You were amazing. Thanks for looking out for the kids," she said, her gratitude evident. "Now you're going to be rewarded. I would have come over sooner, but I had to wait until Horace and Tim left to visit the girls since they're off school today." At work, Brenda was only an hour into her shift when Sue Blaine approached her at the water cooler, clearly wanting to talk. "I heard Brian, Jack Reynolds, and Gus Benson put some punks in their place last night when they messed with a group of kids on D Street. Sounds like a tire iron to the shins does the trick." Brenda quickly pieced it together. Heather must have called her father for help, only to be brushed off. The kids Sue mentioned had to include Holly, along with Horace and Tim. As Sue recounted the events, Brenda's anger toward Bill Grant simmered beneath the surface. Heather had needed her father, and he'd dismissed her. Brian and the others had stepped in to protect the kids, doing what any real man should. That afternoon, Brenda found Bill alone in the break room and confronted him. "Heather called you for help and you ignored her. Those kids could have been in serious trouble and you told her to call AAA. What kind of father does that?" "It all worked out," Bill replied with a smug grin. "Your husband and his pals played heroes. So, what's the big deal?" "The big deal is Brian acted like a real man while you turned your back on your daughter. My son was in that car." Bill smirked. "If your idiot husband's so great, why am I the one screwing you while he hasn't been laid in months? All his heroics won't make his Johnson bigger than mine." "You pathetic excuse for a man! Being a man has nothing to do with what's in your pants," Brenda snapped, her voice dripping with contempt. "Brian is 10 times the man you'll ever be." Bill smirked, leaning back with his drink in hand. "You say that, but last night, you didn't seem to mind choking down every drop. Let's face it, when it counts, I've got your little wimp beat in all the ways that matter." Brenda's face hardened with resolve. "I'm done with you," she said firmly. "Don't talk to me again. I want you out of my life completely." Bill shrugged, unfazed. "Suit yourself. There's plenty of married women out there who know what they want. And they love a guy like me. If you ever change your mind, you know where to find me. Just make sure to ask nicely when you come crawling back." Brenda burst into tears and fled the room. She had betrayed her husband, disrespected their marriage, and jeopardized her family for an arrogant, self-absorbed manipulator. The weight of her choices crushed her, and she silently prayed Brian would never find out how deeply she had failed him. With that realization, she knew she had a lot of work to do to make amends. Minx was just finishing up with Brian, her breath still heavy from the moment, when a sound made her turn. Startled, she saw Brenda standing in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. "How could you do this to me?" Brenda sobbed, her voice trembling. "I trusted both of you, and this is how you repay me?" Calmly, Minx reached for her clothes, sliding them on as she pressed a finger to Brian's lips, signaling him to stay quiet. "I'm doing exactly what you wanted," she replied coolly. "You asked me to keep those blonde bimbos away from Brian, and I used the only method that worked. My body." "I never asked you to sleep with him, and you know it," Brenda shot back, her tears turning into anger. "And Brian, how could you cheat on me with this scrawny tramp?" Minx raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "I get that walking in on this might sting, but let's keep the insults to a minimum. Your husband was desperate for relief, and I simply stepped in to help. Someone had to. Especially since Bill Grant made sure you were too busy to fulfill your wifely duties." Brenda's face turned pale. "You know about Bill?" she whispered. "Who doesn't?" Minx replied nonchalantly. "Your affair with him has been the worst-kept secret in town. He promised you'd never have to sleep with Brian again, didn't he? Convenient for him. Meanwhile, I've been picking up the pieces and keeping Brian sane." Tears returned to Brenda's eyes. If Brian knew, why didn't he say anything? Why let it go on this long? Minx shrugged. "You're a smart woman. What do most men do when they find out their wife's been cheating?" Brenda's voice faltered as she answered. "They get angry. Probably divorce me." "Exactly," Minx agreed. "And what happens after that? Would Brian stay here while you moved in with Bill? Would Tim go with you?" "No," Brenda snapped. "I'd never leave my house, and Tim would stay with me. Brian would be the one forced to leave and pay support." Minx nodded. "And that's exactly why Brian didn't confront you. Staying close to Tim was more important to him than exposing your affair. So instead of a dramatic breakup, he silently divorced you emotionally. You've been living like a separated couple for months. You were just too busy with Bill to notice." Brenda's voice softened. "I told Bill we're done. I ended it after he refused to help his daughter last night. I couldn't stay with someone like that." So you didn't really choose to end it," Minx remarked dryly. "He left you no choice. Even cheaters have their limits, I guess." "Are you and Brian planning to be together now?" Brenda asked, wiping her face. Minx smiled faintly. "We're comfortable with how things are for now. Besides, Horace and I will be moving back to LA before the school year starts. When I go, I might help Brian find someone new if he lets me. Unlike Bill, I'm not here to wreck a family." "You don't have any right to sleep with my husband," Brenda said firmly. "He's mine." Minx's expression hardened. "You forfeited that right the moment you crawled into bed with Bill Grant. That freed Brian of any obligation to you. And trust me, we have rules. Brian isn't allowed to touch anyone else, including you. Not while we're together." Brenda's eyes widened. "You think I'd give him a disease? Who knows what Bill's been up to? You didn't exactly demand a clean bill of health before sleeping with him, did you?" Minx countered. Brenda's tears returned as the reality of her choices sank in. So what happens now? Minx leaned back casually. We keep things as they are. You keep avoiding Brian and working late. I'll make sure he's taken care of. It works, doesn't it? No, Brenda said firmly. I'm not giving up. You'll leave soon and I'll remind Brian what a good wife I can be. Minx laughed. Go ahead. You can cook, clean, and play house all you want. Meanwhile, I'll handle the intimacy. Let's see who wins. Brenda looked at Brian. I'm so ashamed of how I treated you. Can you ever forgive me? Minx cut in. Forgiveness? Maybe. But trust, that's another story. You threw it all away for Bill. You better hope Brian is feeling generous when Tim graduates, or you might find yourself packing your bags. Why are you letting her speak for you? Brenda demanded, glaring at Brian. Minx answered for him. Because I'm not just his lover, I'm his friend. While you were off whispering lies to Bill, Brian and I were having honest conversations. And now, if you'll excuse us, I'd like some time alone with him. Months turned into years as Brian, Brenda, and Gertrude navigated the complexities of their intertwined lives. Tim graduated high school with honors, his passion for baseball evident in every game he played. Brian remained a steadfast figure in his son's life, mentoring Tim and his friend Scooter, whose move to Los Angeles for a prestigious baseball scholarship marked the culmination of Brian's coaching efforts. Brenda, now fully aware of the depth of her betrayal, worked tirelessly to rebuild the fractured relationship with Brian. She began attending therapy to address her decisions and insecurities, seeking a way to reconnect with the man she had once loved. Despite her efforts, Brian remained emotionally detached, his trust too deeply eroded to allow for reconciliation. Brenda turned her energy toward becoming a better mother. She supported Tim through his college applications and attended his games with a fervor she hadn't shown before. Though Brian acknowledged her attempts, he kept his emotional walls firmly in place. Brenda eventually found solace in her relationship with Tim, realizing that her role as a mother was one she could still honor. Brian flourished in his role as foreman, earning respect from his peers and building a new life centered on self-improvement. His garage apartment became a symbol of his independence, a sanctuary where he could reflect and heal. He continued his workouts, developed new hobbies, and even started taking online business courses to explore entrepreneurial aspirations. Gertrude, true to her promise, eventually left for Los Angeles with Scooter. The goodbye was bittersweet. Their relationship had been a lifeline for Brian during his darkest times. They parted on good terms, with Gertrude encouraging Brian to open his heart again when the time was right. With Tim off to college, Brian sold the family home, a house that had become a monument to both his labor and his pain. He moved to a smaller, modern home closer to his workplace, a space that represented his new beginning. Brenda, who had stayed in the family home after their divorce, received a portion of the sale but chose to remain in the area to stay close to Tim. Brian began dating cautiously, meeting women who appreciated his integrity and humor. Though scars from his marriage lingered, he found that his experiences had made him more empathetic and discerning. Tim thrived in college, earning a baseball scholarship and excelling both on and off the field. Brian and Brenda found common ground in their pride for their son, often attending his games together. While their relationship remained cordial and distant, their shared love for Tim brought moments of connection and
Story 4.
When I married my husband, my parents disowned me because they couldn't accept his modest background. Now they want to reconcile because I'm expecting their grandchild. I'm 28, female, and 3 years ago, when I married my husband Luke, 30, male, my family disowned me, and since then we have not spoken to each other. Luke and I had been dating for 2 years when we decided to get married, and my parents had always loved him, so they were quite against the idea of accepting him as part of the family as their son-in-law. The reason for that was really shallow. It was because Luke didn't come from a background like ours. Luke's dad was a high school janitor, and his mom was a stay-at-home mom who had to take care of him and his 2 younger siblings as well. Money was always tight, and Luke never even got to go to college because he had to start working right after he finished high school so he could support his family. When I met him, he had been working as a warehouse worker in a nearby office building, so I would often see him around during my lunch breaks, and after a month or two, I asked him out. I honestly didn't care what his job was or what kind of money he made. He seemed cute, and after a couple of dates, I knew that he was the perfect guy for me. 6 months later, I introduced him to my parents, and they were initially happy to see him, but the more they got to know about his family and his background, the less they seemed to like him. Eventually, they started pressuring me to break up with him because they didn't think we were a good match. Apparently, they wanted to save me from heartbreak and told me that this relationship was never going to work out beforehand because we were just too different, and eventually the honeymoon phase would end. And it was inevitable that we would go separate ways. I come from a really affluent business family. My grandparents started an investment firm, and my parents run it now. It's lucrative, and my parents have always taken pride in their work and the kind of money that they make, where they come from, and the people they associate with. In short, they have always been really snobby, but it has never rubbed off on me. In fact, whenever I would see them act like they were too good for everyone else, it would give me the ick, and from a young age. I decided that I didn't want to be like that, and I think I stayed true to my decision. My parents really wanted both my sister and me to work for them and take their business forward, but honestly, working under my parents seemed like a nightmare, so I started working elsewhere. I was already on thin ice since I had let them down by not joining the business after I graduated, and I think my decision to be with Luke was the last straw. So, when we got engaged, they were furious and gave me an ultimatum that I could either break the engagement off and continue to be a part of the family, or else they would disown me and make my sister the heir to all their inheritance. My sister was the golden child to our parents, and rightfully so, to be honest. She had earned it because right from my childhood she had been exactly the kind of person that my parents had been trying to raise. Sophie, my sister, has always been just like my parents and also took pride in our wealth, even though she hadn't been the one to earn it. She was also just as snobby and narcissistic, and thought she was better than everyone else just because her parents had tons of money. Sophie is my younger sister. She's 2 years younger. So initially, I tried to make her act more like me, more like a normal person, to be honest, but it never really stuck. I guess she was just too innately like my parents to realize that the way they behaved with other people was not right. Anyway, I still used to get along with her when we were really young, but around the time she started high school, she became a bit of a bully, and we stopped sharing a good relationship. It was also pretty sickening for me to constantly be told that I needed to be more like my sister when it came to socializing with people since, according to my parents, I had absolutely no standards. And there was also the fact that she led her life exactly like our parents wanted her to. She got a business degree and started working with our parents so she could take the company forward. And now she was the poster child for what an ideal daughter should be like. My parents, and occasionally even Sophie, had tried really hard to convince me to break up with Luke while we were dating because they didn't agree with our relationship. Unfortunately, they could not succeed, and we got engaged. After my parents gave me that ultimatum, it was a really easy choice for me. I didn't care about their inheritance at all. I just wanted to live a peaceful life with Luke. So, I told them that they could disown me, and I wouldn't have any issues with it. About 3 months before my wedding, my parents publicly announced to the family that they were disowning me for marrying someone who was clearly with me just because I came from a rich family. And they wanted to see how long our marriage would last if I didn't have the money that I did so far and there was no hope for an inheritance. They were pretty confident that Luke would leave me as soon as he found out that my parents had disowned me, and all the inheritance would now be going to my sister. But I guess they were wrong, if the fact that Luke and I are currently expecting our first baby together is any indication. After they disowned me, I was kind of upset about it because, all things said and done, they were still my family, and I really loved them, but I never spoke to them again. They did not reach out to me either. I have continued to work in HR, and shortly after our marriage, Luke was promoted to warehouse manager, and the position came with a significant raise as well. So life has been pretty comfortable, and we have been really happy together. A couple of months ago, we found out that I was pregnant, and it was time to complete our happy little family. My in-laws have taken care of me like their own daughter ever since they found out that Luke and I were together, and have never let me feel the absence of my own family. I was pretty content with life, and there was no drama until 2 weeks ago, when Sophie texted me to let me know that our parents might be visiting me soon. And in case any of you are thinking that she had magically turned into a better person, which is why she had warned me, that's not the case. The only reason she reached out to me to let me know was because she was pissed at our parents. Apparently, 1 year ago, they had set her up with a guy who happened to be the son of a very close friend of theirs. And she had agreed to go out with him, give him a chance, and see where the relationship goes. Our parents always spoke highly of the family since, of course, they were from the same kind of financial background, and that guy was also pretty well off. About a month ago, after dating for almost a year, he proposed, and Sophie accepted. She thought that this would make the family happy, and she was also ready to settle down and start a family of her own. But before they could announce the engagement, the parents of the guy suggested that both of them get fertility tests done because they were really hoping for a grandchild. And their son had already been conned by another woman before this, who hadn't told them that she had had a hysterectomy for medical reasons. So they didn't want to take the same risk anymore. Sophie thought that it was a bit weird, but she agreed to it since our parents wanted her to just get it over with so they could announce the engagement. But unfortunately, they found out that she was sterile. They had her tested a couple more times just to be sure, but every single time the results were the same. My parents took her to the fertility specialists, and they did not have any clear explanation as to why this was the case with her. Eventually, the guy ended up breaking up with her because he did not want to go against what his family wanted. And the loveliest part of all this is that my parents are now blaming her for some reason. I don't even want to get into how messed up all of this is, and I was horrified after reading the text that she sent. And towards the end of the message, it was time for me to be really pissed off because she told me that she was telling me all of this, because she knew that our parents would be reaching out to me soon enough because they had heard from a couple of relatives that I was expecting. And since they didn't have a shot at getting any grandchildren from her anymore, I was their only hope. After reading that message, I spoke to Luke, and we decided that no matter what happened, we were not going to reconnect with them. It was just not worth it. And also, after the way they had treated Sophie, I wanted nothing to do with them. And just like Sophie had said, my parents showed up at my door 3 days back, and when I opened the door, they pulled me into a hug and said that they had heard that they were going to be grandparents now, so they wanted to let go of the past and start afresh. Which is why they were here to reconcile with me, and had even brought gifts for me worth almost $40,000 that were still in the car. It was the mention of the gifts and what they were worth that pissed me off even more. I was just a couple of months into the pregnancy, so I wasn't showing just yet, and I was also wearing really loose clothes. So I just told my parents that what they had heard about me being pregnant was not true. And then I also told them that I had spoken to Sophie recently, and I knew exactly what they were here for. So, even if it was true, I had no interest in reconciling with them. I am my own person, not a baby-making machine, and if they only wanted to reconnect with me now that I was their only ticket to having grandkids, then I didn't want that sort of relationship at all. I also told my parents that I knew my worth, and it was most certainly more than $40,000 before I shut the door. It was really satisfying, and I don't think I had done anything wrong because, after the way they had treated me and also Sophie, I don't think they deserve a chance to have the kind of family that they expected. But after that, my dad sent me a message, and now I'm kind of confused, which is why I'm here to ask for advice on what to do. It's not a really long message, so I'll just paste it here, and you guys can make of it what you will. The reason we came to visit you and make things right is because we know for a fact that you are pregnant. I know you had specifically told everyone not to reveal it to us just yet, but everyone in the family had told us that they thought it was about time to make things right with you, and so did we. You have no idea how sorry your mother and I were about everything after you got married. We had wanted to reach out to you several times, but every time that we spoke about you to the rest of the family, we only got to find out that you still hated us, and we were waiting for you to cool down before we reached out. I guess that was our mistake, not doing anything and constantly just waiting for everything to be calm before we apologized. But I really do want to apologize to you for something that we put you through. We also want to apologize to Luke because we were really wrong about him. It's just that we didn't want him to break your heart, and you know how common it is in our circles to find out that the person your kid was dating turned out to be a gold digger. So we just wanted to save you from that, and I guess we went a little overboard and never really even gave Luke a fighting chance. We were just trying to protect you, but now I see that we didn't do it in the right way. I wish I could have apologized to you a really long time ago, and trust me, your mother and I will always be sorry for what we did. As for whatever Sophie has told you, I can assure you that it's not true, not all true at the very least, since her ex did not dump her because her family found out that she was sterile. There were loads of other reasons that she hadn't mentioned, like she has severe anger issues, and also she was extremely insecure when she was with him. I bet she didn't tell you about all of that, but her ex reached out to us later on to let us know that these were the real reasons he had left her, and not just because she had fertility issues. Lastly, I know you are worth much more than the gifts we bought, but we just wanted to show you how sorry we were. We still are from the bottom of our hearts, and I hope that you see that and forgive us. So this is what they sent, and now I'm really confused. I'm desperate to find out the truth about everything, but I don't know if it's even my business anymore. I also do feel like a bit of a jerk because of how I slammed the door on my parents when they made an attempt to reconcile with me. And now I'm wondering, IITA for rejecting my parents and their attempts to make things right with me? Update 1. So I spoke to Luke about it, and just like many people in the comments, he explained to me that at this point, it doesn't really matter what the truth is. It makes absolutely no difference what the real reason behind the breakup between my sister and her ex is, because ultimately, my parents were only here because I was pregnant. Had that not been the case, they never would have bothered to reach out to me again. And the fact that they had waited for so long really goes to show that they believed they could come and go as they pleased. And I was just going to have to deal with it. He told me that the message they sent me was just an attempt to emotionally manipulate me, and since I was pregnant, I might have been slightly more vulnerable, which is why I kind of fell for it. And I'm going to agree with him there because I have actually been kind of more emotional about everything recently. But Luke was able to find a lot of loopholes in the message that they sent me. For instance, if they really had so much regret about the way that they had treated me, and especially Luke, then they should have just reached out to us at least once. Granted, I did seem angry with them, but how was not talking to me going to fix that? Surely they knew that if they wanted to make things right, they would have to talk to us. They couldn't wait for us to calm down on our own. That's not how things work. And more importantly, it wasn't like they were not aware of the fact that Luke and I kept our finances separate until we got married. In fact, I had been the one to approach Luke and not the other way around, so if he had actually been a gold digger, I'm pretty sure that he would have come to me instead. It was understandable that they were concerned about the differences in our families and financial backgrounds for the first couple of months. But they never even tried to get along with Luke and get to know him. They had actually acknowledged that fact in their message. They had never even given him a chance, and yet they did not have the decency to apologize to him separately. It's not like they didn't have his phone number or didn't know how to contact him. He was on social media, and they could have just reached out to him there if they were really serious about their apology. But the way they were acting, and even the way that they had phrased things, just made it very obvious that they were taking this very casually. So I really don't have any reason to feel bad about what has happened. Talking to him about this has made me feel much better about my decision. I also made up my mind that I was not going to reach out to Sophie because I don't know what her intentions were, but one thing is for sure, she did not reach out to me out of the goodness of her heart. Some people in the comments were saying that I was being too hard on Sophie because she has had a terrible experience recently, and she only wanted to warn me, so I should probably not say such awful things about her because, in the end, she actually did me a favor by warning me that my parents would be visiting. And that might be true, but that doesn't automatically discount whatever she has done in the past. She cut me off the very same day that my parents did and never bothered to check on me again. Not to mention the fact that I had already spoken about how she was as a person in my original post. She had also always been really biased against Luke because of his background, and her behavior was really not any better than my parents. The only reason she even told me about all of this was because she was pissed at our parents. I'm pretty sure if things had worked out with the guy that my parents had set her up with, she wouldn't have reached out to me. And things would have remained the same. So, she did this for revenge on our parents, not because she was looking out for me. I understand that she went through something really horrible, and as a woman, I will always stand by her and maintain that the way her ex and our parents treated her for something that's not even in her control is not right. But as her sister, I'm never going to forgive her, and I really don't have to. I know that now. A couple of days have passed since I last heard from my parents, and after that message, they have not made any attempt to reach out to me again. So, I'm hoping that they will stick to that and they won't contact me after this because I really don't want any more drama. I just want this to be a smooth and happy pregnancy, and for that, they are going to have to stay away. Whether or not I want them to be a part of my life later, I'm going to decide after the baby is born because right now, my own happiness is my top priority. And it's not like my babies are never going to know the love of grandparents or uncles and aunts since my in-laws and even Luke's siblings have made it a point to check up on me, either by calling or visiting every other weekend. It just warms my heart how close their family is and how seamlessly they made me a part of their family as soon as they found out that their son loved me, without any drama or complaints. I wish my family could have done the same, but alas. Update 2. So 2 weeks ago, my parents paid me a visit to reconcile with me, but I had made it very clear that I did not want to speak to them right now. Since then, we hadn't had any interactions, apart from that one text message that they sent me, and I didn't even reply to that. I thought that they would take the hint and figure out that this was not the right time to bother me, but obviously, they couldn't just let this go, and they decided to show up once again yesterday evening. Since it was a Sunday, both Luke and I were chilling at home, and suddenly somebody was at the door, even though we were not expecting any visitors. When Luke looked outside, he saw that my parents were standing outside and asked me whether I wanted to let them in or not, and obviously, I said no. So, Luke told them to leave. And I went to my bedroom because I really didn't want to deal with this right then. I was kind of exhausted and I was not in the mood. But instead of just leaving me alone when Luke told them to, my parents decided to stay at the door and argue with him. They reached such volumes that I was forced to come back out and personally tell them to leave. Even then, they did not stop arguing with me and said that they were only here to make things right with me. And I had to give them a chance. They claimed that they had raised me, and so this was literally the bare minimum that I could do for them. I tried to explain to them that I would speak to them when I was less emotionally volatile, but right now, this was not the time to bother me, and they refused to listen. Instead, they doubled down on why I should be grateful to them for the life that they had given me, and said that I was snatching the chance of being grandparents from them just for a stupid little lapse in judgment that had happened 3 years ago. They sounded really annoyed with me, and that pissed me off because they were in no position to be making demands right now, and their stupid little lapse in judgment, as they put it, had caused a lot of heartache and trauma for me. So maybe it was not as little as they thought, and it was up to me whether I wanted to forgive them now or 5 years from now. They couldn't force me to forgive them, and they needed to understand that. I guess my only mistake in that situation was getting carried away emotionally and arguing with them instead of just calling the cops and letting them deal with it. Anyway, when I started arguing with them, my mother started crying and said that I was being heartless. She said that she had already had to deal with the fact that Sophie was not going to be a mother, and now I was treating her this way in spite of everything that she had been through. I couldn't even believe the audacity she must have had to bring up how she was feeling about me treating her like this when my parents themselves had pushed Sophie into a corner just because she wouldn't be able to have kids. So much so that she literally felt the need to talk to me about it, somebody she hadn't spoken to in years. After that, I just snapped, and I told my parents that in order to be good grandparents, they needed to be good parents first, and they had failed miserably at that job. First, they had ruined their relationship with me just because they couldn't accept the fact that I wanted to be with Luke, and he wasn't a spoiled rich brat like most people in our circle, but was instead an honest and hardworking man, and those were not values that they stood for, obviously. As if that was not bad enough, they had also ruined the relationship that they had with Sophie, their so-called golden child. She had done everything right her entire life just to please them, and in spite of that, they couldn't see anything apart from the fact that she was sterile. They had reduced her to just that one condition and pushed her away, even though her entire life she had done nothing except try and make them happy. At least with me, they had the excuse that I had always gone against them, and that's why they had found it very easy to cut me off. But with Sophie, there was literally no reason for them to be so cruel to her, especially during a time when they should have been supportive of her. They had failed us both, and now they had no right to demand any sort of place in our lives, and I didn't know about Sophie, but I was definitely not going to forgive them anytime soon. If they had really been sorry about what they had done, they would have left me alone and understood that I was not in the right headspace to deal with them as of now. But instead of just dealing with their punishment, which was not to talk to me until I was ready, they decided to force their presence on us and expected me to be okay with it. Well, I was not okay with it, and I told them that even after everything I had said, if they still didn't leave me alone, then I would be forced to call the cops, and that would not look too good for them. It was after that they finally left, and I was extremely upset for hours after that. I shouldn't have come out of my room to talk to them at all, but honestly, I'm glad that, in a way, I was able to get all of this out of my system. I needed to say these things out loud, and I needed them to hear it so they knew just how badly they had failed both their kids. And now that it's out there, I feel much lighter. Of course, I do regret spending my evening fighting with them because it was a total waste of time, but at least some good came out of it. Update 3. Hi guys. So almost 3 months have passed since my last update, and I'm well into my pregnancy now. I'm definitely showing, and my baby will be here in 2 to 3 months, hopefully. Not a lot of things have changed since the last time that I posted here. Part of the reason that I was so inactive was because I didn't have anything to say since my parents finally respected my wishes after that last argument that we had and did not try to contact me any further. And no, I also haven't kept in touch with Sophie because, like I said, we don't really have a relationship anymore. From what I know, some of my relatives told me that she had quit her job and doesn't work for our family business anymore. So it's pretty sad, but I think my parents are not going to be able to live up to their dream of having their daughters continue the legacy of their business, unless I change my mind later on, that is. The reason I'm even posting this update right now is because a couple of days ago I received a phone call from my parents' lawyer. The last time the guy had contacted me, it was to tell me that my parents had disowned me legally, and I was not going to be receiving any inheritance from them. This time, he had the exact opposite news for me. He told me that my parents had decided to reinstate my inheritance and had changed their will to include me once again. I don't know if this is an attempt to kind of appease me before the baby is born, but it hasn't softened me up to them so far. However, if I do think about the future, I would definitely like to take over my parents' company after they retire, and having Luke run it alongside me would be poetic justice. So, I haven't thought about it in detail yet, but I think after my baby's born, I'm going to tell my parents that if they agree to let me take over the company and sign the paperwork for it, then I might consider letting them have a relationship with their grandchild. I know it sounds selfish, but I think Luke and I have worked hard enough, and we deserve this. It will also prove to us exactly how sorry my parents are, and if Sophie wants to work with us, I wouldn't be against that either. But for now, this is just a plan, and I haven't implemented any of it. Luke is on board with this idea, and after the baby is born, we will think about it.